हेलो सर।
हेलो, कहिए शंकर जी।
कैसे हैं सर? नाइस टू सी यू।
हाँ,
doesn't allow us to
ठंड तो
meet,
कम हो जाने से और भी अच्छा लग रहा है।
Thanks.
राइट।
Thanks a lot, sir.
So, Suchitmita,
Yes, sir. Shall I start?
yes, now everything has been set.
Okay, sir. Good morning and welcome everyone in the online workshop presented by Dastan, the Department of History, Atma Sanatan Dharma College, University of Delhi. Dastan, the Department of History of this college, functions as history association of our college. Dastan works throughout the year by organizing various seminars, webinars, workshops, etc., and have emerged as one of the leading societies in our college. Faculty members and the students wholeheartedly participate in discussions and decisions regarding the department. We, the members of our Department of History, consider this noble subject not only restricted to the academic, and hence we work on to realize the potential of reaching a larger audience for a better understanding of everything related to our past. Our endeavors are objected towards justifying the motto we believe in. We see the future in the past. The theme of today's workshop is Blazing the Trails, Changing Historiography of India. Indian history specifically have undergone several historiographical changes, starting with the sort by the colonial historians, followed by the critical evaluation of those by the Marxist and nationalist schools of historians. Later in 1980s, the subaltern school emerged, which emphasized on the concept of history from below. In recent times, a new version of historiography is presented by the ultra-right groups of historians who created their version of history in order to support their demands for Hindutva in Indian society. Hence, it can be said that one historiography is born following the footsteps of the other. I would now request the coordinator of Department of History, Professor Vishwa Mohan Jha, to address the gathering.
Thank you, Suchitmita. It's a pleasant morning in all possible respects. The weather has improved, and we are finally having the first seminar of this semester, of this current year. And above all, it's so good to see Vasudha and Shankar and Nirmal. So, I mean, I must not make it a private conversation between the three of us. Each one of the speakers is a scholar in his or her own right. Budding ones like Shankar Kumar to established eminences like Vasudha Pandey. So the details about their scholarship will be introduced by our students in turn. Here, while I welcome you all, especially our co-speakers, so I should like to go back to my memory lane and say a word or two about each of the three speakers. So, Dr. Shankar Kumar, I have known for several years, and we share a common supervisor, Professor D.N. Jha. He ranks among the more promising of Professor Jha's students for all times. Nirmal, my association with Professor Nirmal Kumar goes back to, Nirmal, do you recall? Late 70s. when we used to share the same university bus for going to our colleges. Along with Nirmal, there was another person who unfortunately, I think, went to civil services, who would have been another outstanding historian. That was Karna Sagar. So are you in touch with Karna Sagar? So
Yeah,
the two were
yeah.
very serious students. And I remember while we were standing and waiting for our seat in the university bus, so I will find Karna Sagar reading a book. He was 16, 17 years old, and that was the autobiography of Bertrand Russell. And what can I say about Vasudha? An inspiration she has been. You have to bear with me. I mean, so to me personally, from the very outset, when we learned that she is a few years senior to me, and when we learned that we were same batch, JNU, that she was already teaching English literature, then she leaves that to devote a lifetime to historical studies. So she gives up a job and takes up historical studies. She was preceded by another remarkable alumnus of Center for Historical Studies, JNU, David Thomas. Yet another was that tripos from Cambridge, Jairus Banaji. Jairus Banaji was a tripos. He comes to JNU, listens to Professor Sarupalli Gopal, and says that he will do history afresh from JNU. David Thomas, a gold medalist in mechanical engineering from Delhi IIT. I mean, I could be wrong in one or two detail, but these people were already legends while they were students. And then we had our Vasudha Pandey amidst us in my batch, 81, 83, leaving English to do history. So since then, what can I say? She has been a super professor to me and to the generations of her students. And we are again privileged to have the very last, but certainly not the least, of her students groomed by her, Dr. Vijika Pandey Singh, amidst us. So I can go on, but let's listen to them first. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It was really nice hearing that from you. Moving forward now, I would like to invite Ishita Chakrabarti to introduce our first speaker.
हर्ष इशिता होस्ट नहीं है, आप उनको एक बार बनाइए को होस्ट।
जी भैया। जी बना दिया है।
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, you are. You can start now.
Okay, thank you.
So greetings everyone. On behalf of Dastan, the History Society of Atmaram Sanatan Dharma College, I, Ishita Chakrabarti, warmly welcomes our first speaker, Dr. Shankar Kumar, for this webinar. We are extremely honored and delighted to have such an eminent personality between us. Dr. Shankar Kumar is an assistant professor at Hindu College at the Department of History. He has done his schooling from Sainik School Tilaiya from science background. At graduation level, he decided to follow his own field of interest and passion, so he pursued history honors from Ramjas College and completed his post-graduation from JNU. He worked with the Confederation of Indian Industry, the Apex Industry Chamber in India. Dr. Kumar proceeded for the Vice Chancellor's Fellowship at the University of Delhi to work in an interdisciplinary mode, aiming at leveraging technological platforms like massive open online courses in the university level pedagogy. Sir has his own research work on ancient Indian medicine, or transdisciplinary studies. Now, let us have a look on the publications made by him. Dr. Shankar Kumar has co-authored the book like France Coincides Social Sciences, and he also co-edited the book like Indian History and Culture. He also writes blogs on Outlook.com. Apart from his written works, he has delivered for more than 70 EDU SAT lectures on history and Indian cultures. Dr. Kumar has also featured as a resource person and expert on several televised programs. He has also participated in the debate on argumentative Indian YouTube channels. Sir has a great interest in the subjects such as ancient India, history of medicine, transdisciplinary studies, modern European history, and history of cricket. So after reading about him, I would really love to say that we all should follow our own passion and should take our own decisions of life. I would now invite Dr. Shankar Kumar to please kindly come and to have and deliver his talk. So please.
Thank you, Ishita. I will need a little bit of an affirmation from your side if my audio is all right.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
All right. So thank you, Ishita, Suchasmita, for wonderful words and nice introduction to this webinar. And it's my sheer delight to share this platform with Professor Nirmal Kumar and Dr. Vasudha Pandey as co-panelists, and the general introduction given by none else than another big gun that we have in history department spread across colleges, Dr. Vishnu Mohan Jha himself. These are the pillars of history teaching at various colleges that we as young recruits to this profession looked forward to. And they are inspirational figures and addressing the students by and large, but getting also to be simultaneously, I would say, scrutinized academically in their presence is a wonderful, I would say, chance for me. Alongside, I also see several of my friends, Ajit, who I know ever since my school days, and Mihir, Mubin, Deepankar. I'm sorry, I can't see the entire screen, the list of participants. I might have missed out on quite a few. I also see some of our colleagues from Hindu, Ritika, and probably Ravi is also there, Ravi Shankar. So I acknowledge your presence, and let me begin what I have to say on this topic. Before I begin, again, thank you for giving a topic to speak where I have complete freedom. Historiography happens to be one such issue over which the lateral latitude of expanding upon what you want to say is tremendous, and I personally love it. It is, I'm presuming, without being instructed anything of that kind, I'm presuming that Professor Nirmal Kumar, coming from medieval specialization, would talk more about the medieval part of the historiography, and Professor Vasudha Pandey would primarily deal with the modern and European aspect of this, the connected aspect of history writing. So I'm taking it on myself that I have to do a little bit of more probing of historiography with respect to the deep past of India. This is how you will come across this reference of ancient India in several of the new publications these days, deep past. Now, some of the preliminaries before I begin. When I say history writing or criticality of historical understanding of a very early period, then there is a sense with which I approach this. That sense is that you have one definitional aspect of history, right? It is the modern definitional aspect of history in terms of sequence of events chronologically arranged in some cause-effect format. That this kind of hold the world over, right? But there is another way in which we have to look at history, and quite a few of us are very much acknowledging this these days. Past does not simply remain somewhere, hidden in the mesh of sources and imagination and so forth, but past is reenacted time and again in the quotidian concerns of ours every day. And when I say past, I include deep past, deep embedded past. Quite a few things that you and I do. We might think that we are being very progressive and very modern in doing so, but when you study them, you realize that you are doing little more than reenacting a deep embedded behavior in the culture and history of the unit from where you are coming. And that is where history becomes more critical. Past over spills into the present, and it will continue influencing the future as well. And therefore, it is extremely important for us to understand those shards of past as a critical resource to understand everything that we do around us, to understand everything that's happening around us, and to make a better sense, to understand as to why we are doing what we are doing, and probably also get a sense, if we are able to figure out the trajectory in which changes have happened, we will be able to figure out as to which way it is likely to go. I know one requires fair degree of foolishness to be very sure and certain of things, particularly of future. But in history itself, you will see, much before the modern history writing began, when the monopoly of revealing history to people at large lay with religious institutions, particularly in Europe, churches, they had everything laid out. They knew when the origin of Earth had happened, and they also knew about the future. And they said so with so much of certainty. I mean, today you realize that degree of confidence you can have only when you are a fool. But that's how it has been. So if you look at the Nuremberg Chronicles, that was one of the earliest printed documents the world over. I think it was published sometime around 1493 or so, just a year after Columbus had set off to discover whatever he did mistakenly, the West Indies as India and so forth. If you look at that, you'll find he had slotted the entire history of the planet, of the world, into 7 days. And that had to do with the Old Testament biblical reference of the origin story. 1 day representing probably the real 1,000 years, 1 millennium. And therefore, the origin of Earth from the present times cannot be traced to more than 6,000 years before. At that point of time, it was like 4,000, roughly 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. And they were also very sure about when it is going to end. And that is how there is some kind of a consensus that you get to see, or you would say some kind of a shared legacy amongst these Semitic religions, Islam included. There is a degree of, there is not much of incongruity between them so far as this part of the story, the origin story, is concerned. And finally, there has to be a day of judgment, and that's how it's going to end. That's the certitude with which history was projected to people at large. And then we have a series of developments that rendered this story too foolish to be believed or to be consumed anymore, right? It is in this big picture that one can locate the different trends of history writing, culminating into the modern scholarship that I think Ishita just underlined. The Orientalists, British administrative historians, the nationalists, the Marxists, the subalterns, and the recent spate of writings emphasizing the magnification of past. Now, I'm not going to talk about this formatting of history writing. I think this is very well known. This is quite well treated in several of the texts of history writing, and therefore students must be quite aware of this. Let's use this opportunity to dwell on something that is germane to history writing, and that is why historiography is so important. And in that context, I would like to emphasize the criticality of colonial studies and its pertinence to deep past, its pertinence to the way we understand about early India, right? When I say the colonial studies, the modern scholarship, as I said, that you can trace to last quarter of, in Indian situation, the last quarter of the 18th century, the entire 19th century, and of course, the 20th century, you will find that you have the Orientalists who are trying to figure out the history and traditions of the land over which now they have to carry out governance. So they reach out to the people who could they reach out to, the Maulvis and the Pandits, to read out, to translate, to help them understand the past of India with reference to the definition, the modern definition, the post-Renaissance, post-scientific revolution, post-enlightenment definition of history That's the yardstick, that's the parameter that they were applying to whatever they encountered in early Indian texts that they were offered to read about India. And it had to help them in the process of carrying out governance, which was a responsibility for them. So what happens is that they are approaching this with a notion of time. And time is the cutting edge of history. Change is the cutting edge of history. And time, there is a history of the notion of time itself, across time, across cultures, right? And that is so central to history writing. That is so central to historiography. Usually we don't talk about it, right? We talk about changing fashion of history writing as per the changing geopolitics or changing political concerns or changing technology and so forth. But we generally don't talk of the changing conceptualization of time or the specific conceptualization of time with which several of the scholars have penned history the way they have, right? And if you are little alert as a student of history, you will realize that the time that we are talking of, the colonial studies, say last quarter of 18th century and the 19th century, this is precisely the time when, even as a European, their own conceptualization when I'll just briefly talk about it. I just told you how small the entire time duration for the European audience was, the way it was revealed by the church, by Christianity, the Christian notion of time, 6,000 years. Now, 6,000 years today is nothing. 6,000 years before the present times, we had several Neolithic communities in different parts of Indian subcontinent, and soon we were to have Harappan civilization flourishing in northwestern part. And as per them, this was the origin of Earth. So obviously, today we know that it was that's how it was. Now, they also had several other biblical references of the flooding and the sons of Noah, and that's how they visualize the world. Now, I just gave you this example of the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is written, say, around 1500s, roughly say 1500. And thereafter, what is happening to the Europeans is that the geographical frontiers of the known world is expanding. All right, so subsequently they came to know about the two Americas, and thereafter, otherwise they thought that on the western side of Europe, the Atlantic spreads so huge that you can circumnavigate and come directly to India. They did not know about this land. So it was a revelation to them, and something had to be done. Similarly, about time also, 19th century is a very important happening century. You have Darwin, you have fossils, you have geological studies that discovered the rock formation and the stratigraphy, and very easily demonstrated to the world that this timeline from origin to the ultimate destination of humanity, this ordained timeline is. So when you do that, you realize that something had to give way, right? So there were several fossils being discovered that definitely said that 6,000 is nothing. It were several thousand years old. And life, living creatures lived on this planet several thousand years before present, right? So it had to be reconfigured, right? And in this process of just imagine the predicament of the scholars, and they are established names. William Jones is one such, right? William Jones is one such, who is writing at this point of time. E.H. Morgan, who is an American anthropologist, and Karl Marx himself is supposed to have read E.H. Morgan to understand as to what Oriental societies are all about, right? And they are caught in the middle of this transformation. There is a subsequent generation of scholars who were well at ease with this redefined notion of time over and beyond the biblical 6,000 years. So they are rather comfortable with it. But these established names are caught in the middle of it. And that ambiguity is something that you can see in the attitude that William Jones himself displayed. William Jones in the Oriental circles and Indic studies is a big name. Is almost, he can be said to have fathered the modern history writing and so forth. I'll just give you a slice of what he's doing. And that is what we should, as historians, look at as well. He's a European. Time span is, of course, 18th century, lifespan 18th century. That's where that's when his works are distributed. In India, of course, he has a different role and stature. Asiatic Society of Bengal, translations, building new historical institutions. And when they discovered the units of time in early Indian sources, we had yugas, right? They read Ramayana, they read Mahabharata, they read several other post-Vedic texts, and they discovered in Mahabharata, yuge, yuge, right? And then they have this cyclic notion of time, Satyug, Treta, Dwapar Yug, Kali Yug, back to Satyug. So the stretch of time that they discovered in early Indian sources was humongous, so huge. And what they had been told about time, 6,000 years, ever since the origin to the end of everything, right? Obviously, the initial reaction of the Orientalists was to dismiss this vast expanse of time in Indian sources as ridiculous, imaginative, nothing more than fables. Fables is the word that they use, right? Fabled history. They even labeled the charge that we did not have historical consciousness. That you must have read a lot in your undergraduate syllabus, so I'm not touching upon that. So this is what is the initial knee-jerk reaction. And then in the middle of their life as a scholar, they find their own notion, their own European notion of, or Christian notion of time getting pulverized by not these historical accounts, but by science itself, right? So geology, Darwin, and fossil studies, they are arguing for a larger unit of time that should have been there for us to make a better sense of what happened to our planet and when it all began and where we are, right? So you will find that in the middle of it, they realized that, well, the Indian or ancient Indian references to these units of Yuga, Manvantar, and so forth, or astronomical time, right? They are better suited to make better sense of astronomical time. खगोलीय घटनाओं का अच्छी समझ आपकी बन सकती है अगर समय की इन इकाइयों का आप प्रयोग करें. Now, what do they do about it, right? So there is that ambivalence. And just look at what he is doing, what William Jones is doing to this piece of knowledge with, in Europe, in European context. All of us know about Voltaire, right? That big gun of enlightenment. And he stands for reason. He stands for that scientifically revealed stretches of time. He doesn't go by the biblical notion of time. So William Jones in European context, in European intellectual context, is pitted against Voltaire. And he uses the Puranic reference of the Great Flood, our own tradition, Indian tradition of great flooding, as an evidence from outside Christendom to reaffirm the timeline, because the Christian timeline talked about the great flooding, the flooding of Noah and his sons, and it is his sons who spread out to different areas and inhabited planet, and that is what history of humanity should be all about. So he uses Puranic reference to assert in European intellectual tradition against Voltaire, which obviously he lost, Voltaire won, but this is what he's doing. So in India, he is dismissing it as fabled history. In Europe, he is citing it as an example to reaffirm the biblical notion of time. That's the ambivalence at best for you, right? And it happens to every historian. As we keep doing things with a particular approach and givens and thumb rules, and in the middle of it, we discover that, well, this will not suffice. The ground beneath has changed completely. This happens not only to historians, this happens to sciences also. Newton had a virtual monopoly of physics, monopoly over physics for a good 200 years, right? Till this fellow Einstein came and gave the theory of relativity, right? And it required someone of the brilliance of Einstein who could understand some of the counterfactual realities to actually do away with this kind of dominance of Newtonian physics. So it was a paradigm change. It happens with every discipline. And that is what I'm alluding to, right? So when you look at these colonial studies, you'll find that there are two tangents that are very important, or they are the spin-offs of the colonial studies. One is that it gave fillip to what we today understand as historical linguistics, right? And this is as a consequence of the confluence of the two traditions, European traditions and the Indic tradition. We were good at our own language, Sanskrit language. It had a very sophisticated grammar and there were texts for it. So analysis of languages was robust in our own tradition, and the Europeans were good in understanding the historical connection of languages and tagging it with specific set of people. It is in this context that the idea or proposition of Indo-European languages came, right? Which seeks to establish the intrinsic connection, phonetic and several other structural connections between languages like Sanskrit, English, Greek, and so forth, right? And we all are very much aware of it. It's an old story. And this ignited a lot of imagination, and it's a charming domain to research on. And you will find the entire 19th century, 20th century scholars getting sucked into, so brilliant minds working around this historical linguistics. So history was sought to be apprehended through language, or language as the entry point of history, of people, of nationalities. So language and nation. This bonding, or this coming together of language and nationhood. And remember, 19th century is also the time when nations and nation states are coming up in Europe. So it gelled well, and it consolidified. It stayed there. It still stays in our memory. We still work with those presumptions, right? So there is a fruitful side to it. This, alongside the second spin-off of the colonial studies was, now here it was not coming together of the two traditions. Here it was a clash of chronologies. I was just reading for this lecture the book by Thomas Trotman, and you can read. It has fantastic chapters on different themes and different subjects pertaining to this. Now, as I just elaborated towards the beginning of my lecture, that the notion of time, the notion of chronology is something that 19th century Indian scenarios saw a flashpoint. Here, there was no coming together. It had to be resolved in favor of one. Obviously, the Christian notion of time was rejected very convincingly. And the Indian notion of time that was rejected earlier as fantasy perhaps proved to be better suited for larger units of time, say light years or astronomical times, that was ratified by several empirical studies subsequently. So there is fair degree of ambivalence. You can't do away with one and the other. Now, before I finish, let me conclude in 5 minutes or so as to what I'm trying to say. When you look at this colonial studies and the scholarship at present, and when I say at present, you can include the scholarship all across the 20th century as well. Nationalists, Marxists, subalterns included, right? What is happening is that colonial studies happen to be the default starting point for both those who outright reject the capacity of colonial studies to offer any fruitful insight into the deep past of India, because it is massively compromised by colonial interests, right? It is tainted. It is tainted to the extent colonial interest is so overpowering in colonial studies that it can't be a good entry point to understand what the past of India was all about. So one segment of historians are one who completely reject this, that you can't use the vantage point of colonial studies to step into deeper history of India or deep past of India. On the other hand, what happens is that this rejection, this outright rejection itself creates or clears the ground for a section of historians who seek to write history afresh. And this includes what Ishita just said, the right-wing histories, the magnificence or the magnificent version of history. So since this is done away with, you get this kind of a ticket to write history the way you want to write, as per the concerns of the present, as per the aspirations of the nation and nationalities and nation states in the present times. And that has its own pitfalls in terms of exaggeration, right? That you and I keep seeing. So This is what I wanted to say in terms of framing of historiography, particularly with reference to deeper past of India that we otherwise refer to as ancient or early India. So what's the way out? It's a problem. Let's acknowledge that it's a problem. We don't clearly know as to what could be the way out. There are some promising paradigms. The one of big history, I have done one piece on Outlook, in Outlook on this. One could be that big history perspective. The other could be to read history with the intent of using it as a resource to understand the present, rather than to create a magnificent past or to devalue our past, either of the two. And I have explained to you as to how it is both emerging as the starting point with reference to the colonial studies. So when we approach history with the intent of using it as a critical resource to understand what's happening, everything around us, why we behave the way we do, understand it with reference to what's happening in psychology, understand it with reference to what is happening in sciences, right? And there you get to know that, in our own memory, what resources our own minds dig into to make sense of something that's around us. We might not be cognizant of it. We are not cognizant of a major portion of memory that's embedded in our mind. And it's all ordained from our past experience. So why we behave the way we behave may not exactly be apprehended by some training, because it's there, and mind has its own algorithm. What memory it will dig into, the fears, the lures, the sensibilities, the patterns, right? They can be culled from there. So these are some of the way out that I think of, and we as students of history need to be open to researches happening on these fronts or in these fronts, and leverage it in our history writing. So I think I might have overstepped my time limit, and it would be sheer delight to listen to the big guns slotted hereafter. I can see smiling face of Nirmal ji, and Dr. Vasudha Pandey is also waiting, and I'm so eager to listen to them. And if there are any questions, as the organizers decide, I can take it now or towards the end of the program. Thank you. That's it. I'm done.
Thank you so much, sir, for your words. So with this, I would request all the participants to write down their questions in the chat box, if any, and the questions will be taken at the end. Till then, we are moving forward. Greetings, everyone. I, Abhishek Kumar Gupta, feel really elated to introduce our second speaker of this workshop, who is Professor Nirmal Kumar. Sir has doctorate in history with medieval period as his area of specialization, and he has teaching experience of more than 35 years. And at present, he is professor in Department of History, Shri Venkateshwara College. He have taught many courses such as History of India 12 to 1500, History of India 15 to 1600, and History of India 1600 to 1750, and also Understanding Popular Culture. He was the principal investigator in sustainable tourism and revival preservation of hill cultures and ecology in abandoned villages of Uttarakhand, which is a pilot project sponsored under National Mission of Himalayan Studies under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change for a period of 3 years. Sir has also authored various books such as My Journey, Unfinished, Unending in Social Scientist in South Asia, Personal Narratives, Social Forces and Negotiations. Negotiating Water Bodies of Delhi, a Historical Perspective, Water Problems in Medieval Delhi, Chamchori, Body, and its violation in the 18th century Rajasthan. So now with this, I would like to invite Professor Nirmal Kumar to take over. Sir, please.
Thank you, Abhishek. And I also find that I'm in a very august company of my friends like Shankar and Vasudha, and of course, my senior, who happened to be a legend in his own lifetime, Vishmohan Jha. And what he mentioned about the university bus, he didn't tell you that we always had to vacate a university bus seat for Vishmohan ji, and one of his friends who also is a top level journalist now.
Come on, Nirmal, you are not that polite then.
And also that Vishmohan ji has been, was a legend even when he was a student. He was 2-3 years senior to me, and we were in awe of him. I mean, we can't really imagine what kind of, what kind of awe we had for Vishmohan ji. I mean, it's unparalleled. And I still, after I think 40 years in this university, I came in 1991, 41 years. I have been teaching for 35 years. That admiration for Vishmohan ji remains intact. And in fact, it has increased by his scholarship, by his everything. Shankar has been a kid brother. I have, in fact, interviewed him in my college. We couldn't retain him, and it was a loss to Hindu. But we were pretty particularly impressed by his scholarship and his, of course, his superb command over English and his voice. In fact, if you hear him in person, he used to joke him like he's like voice quality is of that of Amitabh Bachchan. I mean, he's quite good. Truly humble guy, smiling guy. Vasudha ji, we have met very rarely, but Vasudha has been a legend in Delhi University circles. Everyone knows her. And so are the people in ARSD like Ajit, Mubin, and others. We have been following Mubin writes much more than we all do. And she's full of writing in all the newspapers and everywhere. So we are in a very august company and students of ARSD. I last time also when I came and I spoke on Bhojpuri cinema, one of the books that I'm working on, and taken a sabbatical of 1 year to work on that, is that is the best thing to be called by a neighbor. I mean, and sometimes it could be very critical, but ARSD has been a neighborhood college, a next door neighbor. So it's an honor, and thank you, Ajit. Thank you, Vishmohanji. What Shankar has already talked about is a very magisterial, in his very magisterial speech. He is magisterial, in fact. So his speech, I wouldn't touch on that. I would just concentrate on what Shankar had already hinted and ordered me to restrict myself to medieval. And I know nothing about that. I know only about medieval and a little bit on films that I work on. I'm currently working on LGBTQ community in film industry. So it is my knowledge is very limited. Is very, very limited. And I'm from that point of view as a more as a teacher of history rather than a historian that I'm talking about today. And then I'm very concerned about the kind of terms which we use. Why do we use medieval? Why do we use 18th century? Why do we use early modern? Why do you use historical categories like we had earlier? We had Hindu, Muslim, and British India. Of course, a lot of people have written on that, so I wouldn't go into that. But then it was replaced by ancient and medieval. My generation, when I was a student of Delhi University, we always call, even now we call it ancient India paper. This is, Shankar is an ancient teacher of ancient India. We always say that. I mean, ancient India, medieval India, modern India, and then creeps in some concept like early medieval, late medieval, and early modern. It's very difficult for many of us to understand. And then we go on for another syllabus revision, and then borrowing from West, of course. We always have borrowed from West. We have been so impressed by them. And then again, we take up like centuries, like it is history of 15th century, 16th century. So we have history of India from early period to 750, 750 to 1200. 1200 to 1500, 1500, 1600, 1600 to 1755, 1750. This is the kind of history we have today. In Delhi University also, we all are familiar with the courses. What is the import of this? What holds for medieval in this? Now, for that, we have to understand whether these concepts hold for India. I'm not very sure. Did we have a medieval in India? What is medieval then? You open the Google, you Google it. The first thing which comes to you is medieval is barbaric, ruthless, cruel. It's also a time. It's also connotation. It's also cultural connotation. That medieval is barbaric. Medieval is cruel. Medievalism, medieval barbaric behavior, all that comes to your mind. It also comes to your mind a European connotation. That what is the medieval? When did you have this rise of modern West? So you don't have history books writing like that, okay, fine, 1st May 1453, the people of Europe, the people of Milan and Pisa, they got up and said, lo and behold, modern has come. And we don't believe in that now. But I grew up reading books like that, which said that 1453, one particular day, if I'm not very wrong, it was 1st May, that people got up in Italy and Renaissance countries and Renaissance cities and said, lo and behold, the modern has come. Now their modern has gone to 1453. But the moment it comes to India, we push modern to 1750, then 1757, then 1764, 1800, 1800s. We are not modern yet. What is modernity? I'm not going into that. But I definitely would like to say whether we had kind of how loosely we have used medieval in India in Indian history writing. Shankar has aptly pointed out the problematics of history writing in India, how we are borrowing the concepts from Europe without sometimes able to understand that they don't fit in a multicultural, multiracial, multilinguistic, multi-regional country, where every place, where every region, every locality must have its own history. It's a large landmass we are talking about. Population-wise, if you take the population of Uttar Pradesh itself, it would equal more than many of the countries of Europe. In fact, entire continent. They have countries like Poland, Denmark. They have countries like Austria. They have population of maximum is Austria, which is 8 million. And then you have 5 million, 4 million. That kind of population, what are you talking about? When you talk about them, then you have to think that these models just don't fit in India, where we are talking of even 1595, Irfan Saab and Shirin Musvi are talking of a population between 90 million to 110 million. You can't really compare. As the landmass is concerned, probably few districts of Uttar Pradesh would be more than much of the Europe. We are talking of a huge landmass. We are talking from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, literally in literal parlance. If you talk about that, there's no standard definition of which is medieval and which is modern. Now let's look at it. What is medieval for India? Is the medieval same as what we make out in our syllabuses, 750 to 1200? So it's early medieval. Medieval word keeps in. Then you have 1200 to 1500. Medieval word is still intact. 1200 to 1500, medieval is intact. 1500 to 1750, medieval words is intact. I teach all 4 papers. And then I'm still a medievalist, because whether I teach 750 or whether I teach 1765, 1750, I'm still in medieval zone. I don't come out. What kind of world we live in, where we have medieval reaching out to this? So there was a period when medieval would be Islamic period, with the coming of Islam, 1190, 1100, somewhere it was 1000, somewhere it was 1200. All universities, the medieval paper will start around this, around the Turkish invasion. Some people did before, some people did later, and then came the whole lot of thinking when the syllabus was revised in 1981, when I joined Delhi University. And the first time the syllabus was revised, and unfortunately for us, for the last 41 years, syllabus has remained almost the same. Same social formation paper, same rise of modern, which was introduced with us. We were the first batch to do that. Unfortunately, we are still doing that. So what happened? So medieval started, we said that, okay, fine, medieval doesn't start from this, medieval starts from 750, because ancient ended somewhere there. And then who's going to decide what is ancient? Who's going to decide what is medieval? Did we really have a medieval in India? If at all we had, then how come what is medieval in South is not medieval for us? Well, how come what is ancient for us is not same for the South? Chola Empire and Vijayanagar would be taught as ancient in South, while we teach it in medieval. One of my professor, we all know him, TKV Subramaniam sir, was teaching ancient India and was teaching both till up till Vijayanagar in Madras, as he was an ancient India professor. When he came to Delhi and he was given to teach, he wanted to teach ancient India, but he was given to teach the paper of medieval India. He is a medievalist. Same paper, there is a similar paper about this confusion in Indian History Congress by Keshwan Valuthart. Where do they belong? What is Chola? For them it is ancient, for you it is medieval. It's not similar. Would my medieval in Delhi would be the same as medieval of Odisha? No. Of Assam? Of any other country? Of any other states? Of any other region in India? So it would differ. So do we have a universal medieval? One. Second, do we have medieval at all? I'm not very sure. What do you mean by medieval is very, to me it is very confusing. Do you call medieval is 750 and also the Sultanate period and also the Mughal period? Akbar definitely had a very different state system, very different administration, which was very, very benevolent and be called as benevolent and enlightened as any other European state. But do we have a word like enlightened despotism in India? No, we don't. British were enlightened. You had a nationalist state in Europe. But Indian rulers, whatever they did, imagine in 16th century, an emperor is calling Hindu, Muslims, Jains, Gorakhpanthis, Nathpanthis, everybody to discuss and allows priests to talk about him, allows religious debate in his Ibadat Khana Akbar as early as 1560 and 70. He's not called enlightened. I mean, at least you don't use the word enlightened despot. You don't. He's still a Mughal ruler. Much less enlightened ruler of England would be called, you would have an enlightened despotism there. So the thing is that we have not really imbibed, we didn't have a medieval. Let me tell you, we didn't have a medieval. We confuse. We often, use these jargons without and periodization, without understanding whether they are going to be, what happened to be applied in a country or not. What happened to the marriage system? What happened to taboos? What happened to the social systems of Hindus and Muslims in India in the period when we call medieval? Didn't they change? Do we have a topic like that? Look at your syllabus. The greatest and the biggest conspiracy against studies, students, and the discipline of history are the syllabuses. I always call them, I have always written in many newspapers and others that they are basically crony topics and crony syllabuses. Friends, followers, groups, their books, their articles would come in this. I mean, I teach medieval and I'm absolutely at a loss to understand few of the topics and few of the jump topics which we have. For example, we have a Kakatiyas in second year. In first year, we don't teach Kakatiya. In second year, we don't teach Kakatiya. We have Kakatiya inscription. But why? Why did you give them background? When I stand in class and teach to you, young student of 17 and 18 and old, you have no background of Kakatiya. So where do the Kakatiya jump in? Why do we have a book like Mirzanama? In fact, when the Mirzanama was introduced, a couple of my good friends were involved in the syllabus making, and I asked them at IIC, we all publishers, we all writers of Sage, we meet once in a year. I have 2-3 books from Sage. So we met and I asked the person, what is the book you would refer me to read about Mirzanama? They had no answer. वो देख लेंगे syllabus में है. So I said, but you have formed the syllabus. ठीक है, अबुल फजल तक तो बर्दाश्त कर लिया. वो अब आपने मिर्ज़ानामा घुसा दिया. मैंने why? It's a peripheral interest. It's a book of Waqiat-e Mushtaqi. It's a peripheral interest. Not even that. Tell me how many times in a history book you would actually need to read these books to write about the history of medieval India, even if the history is just state, and state. We have written nothing about it. We are so fascinated with the state. Balbang theory of kingship, projects of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, architecture is statist, Mansabdari is statist, religious policies as status. Even then, tell me how many times would you need Waqiyat-e Mushtaqi and you would need Mirzanama to talk about it. Why do you come in the syllabus? So what happens? Please understand, there's a grand design. And for saying that, one must be trolled. One must be criticized if one stands up and says that these syllabuses were made to please certain people and to create fictitious generalization and topics which were never there. I'll tell you how do we justify. I write a book. I make the syllabus. I put the questions in the examination. So I'm defied. I write a book on Akbar's religious policy when there was none. Akbar never promulgated a religious policy like government today has done, NEP, new education policy. He never said that. It is jumbling off with all his acts throughout his 50 years of rulership. So we say Akbar's religious policy. Now I write an article and then I am the examiner. So I put a question. So you as a student, 17, 18-year-old student, you deify that, you glorify that, you accept that as fait accompli or as a fact that Akbar had a religious policy which was liberal. I'm not saying whether liberal or not, I'm not going into that. But what I'm saying is whether he had a policy in the first place. So what helps them? Syllabuses. You standardize, you make them the gospel truth. Why don't we have the history of society? Because you don't research in them. You know, medieval is a very weird, is a very strange place of existence where we are neither ancient nor modern. हम राजे रजवाड़ों में थे नहीं पर मुगल बादशाह तो थे. हम नए हुए नहीं क्योंकि हम ब्रिटिश थे नहीं. Modern तो तभी आया जब ब्रिटिश आया. Battle of Buxar was the greatest, or Palasi was the greatest war. It was a fluke, but the greatest war which changed the history of India. जब यूरोप में आप पढ़ाते हैं, I have taught in 3 countries, तो एक बड़ा अजीब सा एक समा होता है. वहां पे आपका जो ब्रिटिश टीचर होता है या जो डेनिश टीचर था डेनमार्क में मेरे साथ पढ़ा रहा था, तो उसने कहा कि then that unfortunate thing of Jallianwala Bagh happened and General Dwyer had to open a fire. I mean, even sitting like a, मैं उनके पैसों पे था, वो मुझे पैसा दे रहे थे, लेकिन मुझसे चुप नहीं रह गया उस क्लास में. I said, no, he didn't have to open fire, poor guy. He lined up the cannons and fired at the Baisakhi congregated. Depend करता है पढ़ाते किस हिसाब से हैं. Battle of Palasi और Battle of Buxar के बाद जो ट्रेजेडी थी ब्लैक होल की, वो कुछ 13-14 आदमी से होते होते 57 आदमी पे पहुंच गया है. कितने लोग मरे थे, कितने लोग क्या हुए थे. एक यूरोपियन कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ हिस्ट्री जो हमसे अलग है, वो अपनी हिस्ट्री पढ़ाते हैं. When I was teaching in Austria, I signed a paper in German, of course, I couldn't read. I came to know only toward the end when an Indian doctor read out that document to me that I will not question Holocaust. उसका जेल है, आप terminate हो सकते हैं. As a historian, I'm supposed to question everything. Everything. Even whether Akbar was there or not, even when Rana Pratap was there or not, even when, from one prime minister to another, from one king to another, from one region to another, Shankar had so brilliantly pointed out that our right to question, but वो हम साइन करते हैं कि हम उसको नहीं चैलेंज करेंगे, ऑस्विच को चैलेंज नहीं करेंगे, इन्वेस्टिगेट नहीं करेंगे, और our jobs will be terminated. Thanks. A lot of freedom in Europe. The first world I'm talking about, Vienna University. ये तो है freedom. तो हमारे यहाँ क्या होता है? हम क्या करते हैं उसको? अपने आप से medieval decide कर लिया हमने. 100 आदमी दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी के बैठते हैं, वो कहते हैं अब medieval 750 हो गया. और आप unquestioningly उसको इसलिए मान लेते हो क्योंकि that is a part of its syllabus. The books are written like that. एग्जाम में वही पेपर आता है. You get a history of India 750 to 1200. तुम करोगे क्या? तुम उसको मानते हो कि अच्छा ये तो early, टीचर आपको क्लास में बार-बार बोलता है it's early medieval. Do we have a century? Do we have century-based history, 1500, 1600, 1200, 1500? It's again a very European concept. We didn't have watertight developments like this. We had certain, and of course Europe also had, but we also had certain like caste, religion, continuing over centuries. आप कैसे पढ़ाओगे कास्ट को 1200 to 1300? 1301 में क्या हुआ? कास्ट को खत्म हो गया, मॉडर्न हो गया. 1401 में फिर मॉडर्न हो गया. कैसे होता है? मैरिज सिस्टम, टबूस. अनफॉर्चुनेटली हम पढ़ाते भी नहीं इसको, हम पढ़ाते ही नहीं है इसको. जो हमें इनकन्वीनियंट लगता है हमको पढ़ाते ही नहीं है. सूफिज्म हार्डली पढ़ाते हैं, भक्ति हार्डली पढ़ाते हैं. जो हमें इनकन्वीनियंट लगता है हमारे सेट पैराडाइम को चैलेंज कर देगा, हम उसको बाहर कर देते हैं. दिक्कत यह है कि 18th century wise distribution of papers is again not really advisable, not really done. This is against history. What I call always is that we are against history. हम जो लिखते हैं, हम जो पढ़ते हैं, वो हिस्ट्री के खिलाफ होता है. हम गलत टाइप से हिस्ट्री पढ़ते हैं, गलत चीजें पढ़ते हैं. इसलिए कोई किसी का इसमें इंटरेस्ट होता है. It's not a political statement. It's a statement I am giving you after 35 years of teaching, that I feel that when I stand and teach and take one class, one whole class, I take on, say, for example, some unknown monument of Delhi, I feel that I have done injustice to the bigger monuments of India. कुछ असम पढ़ाते हैं, कुछ मणिपुर पढ़ाते हैं, कुछ नागालैंड पढ़ाते हैं, कुछ भी पढ़ाते हैं, कुछ साउथ का थोड़ा बहुत. एक शिवाजी छोड़ के मराठा के बारे में क्या जानते हो? Why are we so afraid of teaching religion? Why are we so afraid of teaching caste? Why? What happens? हम कंटेंशियस एरिया में जाना नहीं चाहते, हम रीजन्स को पढ़ाना नहीं चाहते. तो उसमें होता है क्या कि what we get is basically everywhere, not in Delhi University, but everywhere we get a very period centric, very location centric history. And then एक और जो मुझे चीज वरी करती है कि हम मिडिवल रहे कब तक. तो शुरू में मैं बोल रहा था, हम कब तक मिडिवल रहे? सारी जिंदगी, हम सारी उम्र, सारी सिविलाइजेशन, we remain medieval. We didn't become modern at all. So while Europe became modern, you have rise of modern West from 1500, period like Renaissance, period like Reformation. इंडिया में कुछ नहीं हुआ. There was the Bhakti, there was the Sufism. There is a Muslim king who sits and discusses in 16th century when Christians and Muslims are fighting with Christians, are fighting with Christian, and Muslims are fighting with Muslims. There is a Muslim king in India who invites all religious leaders to this thing and to his ibadat khana and cries with them. He goes to a church and sees Virgin Mary and crucified Christ, and he cries. चलो नाटक था, मेलोड्रामा था, पर कितना इंटरेस्टिंग था. आज की तारीख में भी कोई आदमी हिम्मत नहीं कर सकता इतना नाटक भी करने का, और नाटक भी 1-2 दिन नहीं, 50 साल. Commendable. Why don't we call him early modern? What stops him? There are few books now started, basically Americans, they've started calling it modern, early modern. पर जैसे ही आपने उसको early modern कहा, सारी तरफ से तीरें आपके तरफ चलने लगती हैं, क्योंकि लगता है कि आपने फिर वो डेंजर कर दिया, वो मुगल पूरा हटा दिया वर्ड. नो, इट्स नॉट लाइक दैट. कैसा आदमी था जिसने पूरी ब्यूरोक्रेसी बदल दी. सोचो तो आप, मनसबदारी नंबर पे, जब जात और पात और धर्म इतना इंपॉर्टेंट था, यू आर नॉट अ हिंदू मनसबदार, यू आर नॉट अ मुस्लिम मनसबदार, यू आर अ 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000, 2,000, 5,000 मनसबदार. इमेजिन कोई 16th century में किसी को उसको तुर्क नहीं कह के, मुगल नहीं कह के, कहे 5,000 मनसबदार. कैसा बड़ा रेवोल्यूशन था. Look at his land revenue system. Look at his, whatever the Deen Ilahi or Tawhid Ilahi, whatever the religious experiment that he was making. Such a brave man. Badaini says that one day I found Akbar को अकबर नहीं बल्कि पूरे उसके अपने समय में तो जलालुद्दीन ही बोलते थे. जलालुद्दीन appearing in the court with tonsured head, बाल घुटाकर, the chandan all over his body, sandalwood paste, and to the boot he was also wearing a jane or yagyopavit. He said, I thought Jalaluddin has become a Brahman. Brahman means Brahman or Hindu. He remained a 5-time Namazi. Mandaret writes in 605, alas, this man has died 5 times Namazi. But इतना कर लेना, लोगों से बातें करना, लोगों की बातें सुनना, अपने खिलाफ सुनना. जब दीन इलाही वो प्रपोज कर रहे थे, तो मान सिंह जो उनके रिश्तेदार भी थे और प्रोमिनेंट नोबल थे, घंटे भर बोलते रहे दीन इलाही के खिलाफ। उनका बड़ा फेमस स्टेटमेंट है कि इफ आई बाय जॉइनिंग दीन इलाही, इफ आई प्रूव माय लॉयल्टी टू यू, देन बी इट, अदरवाइज आई वोंट। कैन यू इमेजिन दिस काइंड ऑफ political strength today in any person before the chief minister and prime minister in modern India? उसी समय मिनिस्ट्री से निकाला जाएगा। On the other hand, Man Singh was promoted later on to from 5,000 to 7,000. He was the only officer at that time who was promoted to 7,000 rank. कैसी डेमोक्रेसी थी, कैसा टॉलरेंस था, आप देखिए इसको। अजीब सी हरकती थी। इबादत खाना में अकबर को अपने जो सरदार थे वो कहते थे कि आपने हिंदू वाइफ को हिंदू क्यों रहने दिया, कन्वर्ट क्यों नहीं किया। शेख अब्दुल नबी, मखदूम अल मुल्क ऑब्जेक्ट करते हैं उनपे कि आपने अपने घर में मंदिर क्यों बनाने दिया। डिस्कशन कैसे हो रहे हैं कि क्या आपको 4 वाइफ से ज्यादा अलाउड है, आपकी पेंटिंग बन सकती है कि नहीं, बादशाह के सामने उसी कमरे में। जस्ट इमेजिन द काइंड ऑफ टॉलरेंस। वी डोंट कॉल हिम एनलाइटन, वी डोंट कॉल दिस पीरियड द अर्ली मॉडर्न। If you look at the revenue system and patta kabuli system, where the peasant had the right to accept, even though he had no choice, but accept, कम से कम principle में तो है। आज इनकम टैक्स आप पे लग जाती है, कट जाती है, हमारी सैलरी से कट के मिलती है हमें, हम कुछ नहीं बोल पाते, पर एक कपुटाइन कबूलियत है। आज इनकम टैक्स डिपार्टमेंट लिखे कि फाना निर्मल कुमार आप इतना टैक्स पे करेंगे कि नहीं, तो शायद मैं मना कर दूं, लेकिन ये ऑप्शन तो मेरे पास है नहीं। अकबर ने दिया। What a kind of democratic setup he was trying to evolve in a state which was trying to take the consent of the taxpayers, trying to listen to them. From Jharokha Darshan to Darbar, he was listening to them. ठीक है, कोर्ट का लैंग्वेज नहीं बना, लेकिन ब्रज और अवधि में बहुत अच्छी अच्छी कविताएं लिखी जा रही थी। और तो और उनके अपने प्राइम मिनिस्टर, उनके अपने मिनिस्टर, बड़े इंपॉर्टेंट आदमी रहीम खान खाना, कैसा जमाना रहा होगा आप सोचिए। हम उसको आराम से उसको मिडीवल या मुगल कह के उसको दरकिनार कर देते हैं। अच्छा, कभी लगा आपको कि आपने पूरी की आप कबीर के बारे में थोड़ा सा पढ़ लेते हैं, कभी मीरा के बारे में थोड़ा सा पढ़ लेते हैं, मीरा एज अ विमेन भक्त, मीरा एज अ रेबल, बट व्हाई डोंट वी टीच मीरास का पद इन हिस्ट्री? व्हाई डोंट वी टीच रीड लिटरेचर? व्हाई डोंट वी रीड तुलसी रामायण? व्हाई डोंट वी रीड कुरान? व्हाई डोंट वी रीड अदर इस्लामिक स्क्रिप्चर्स? होता क्या है कि पूरा का पूरा एक फिलॉसफी बन गई है जिसमें हम वही चीज पढ़ाना चाहते हैं जिससे हम कन्वीनियंट होते हैं, जिससे हम बोरोड स्ट्रक्चर्स हैं। ये तो द बोरोड स्ट्रक्चर वी बोरोड फ्रॉम वेस्ट। हम इसमें बहुत कोकून होते हैं, बहुत सेफ फील करते हैं। दैट इज व्हाई व्हेनेवर वी टॉक ऑफ हिस्ट्री ऑफ थीम्स एंड थीमेटिक हिस्ट्री ऑफ विजुअल कल्चर, हिस्ट्री ऑफ फूड, history of technology, history of agrarian taxation, maybe history of state system, immediately घंटियां बजने लगती लोग के कान में कि हमारी जमींदारी निकल जाएगी। वो जमींदारी बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंट है। जो किताबें लिखी हैं आपके यहाँ पे तो बर्बाद हो जाएंगी। अगर आप हिस्ट्री ऑफ फिल्म पढ़ाओगे, हिस्ट्री ऑफ फोटोग्राफी पढ़ाओगे, हिस्ट्री ऑफ म्यूजिक पढ़ाओगे, तो वो जमींदारियां कहाँ जाएंगी जो अभी तक चल रही हैं? दैट इज द होल डिफिकल्टी विद मिडीवल। वो एंशिएंट में भी है, मॉडर्न में भी है। जो मैं आपके जब अजीत जी ने मुझे इनवाइट किया बोलने के लिए, तो मैं थोड़ा सा फेसबुक पर मैंने ट्राई किया लिखने के लिए कि वो किताबें हम क्यों नहीं पढ़ाते, जो किताबें पॉपुलर होती हैं, जो अच्छी किताबें होती हैं, जो क्लिश नहीं होती, विच आर नॉट जार्गनिस्टिक, जिनको समझने के लिए आपको पूरा समाज कमरे बंद करके, लाइट बंद करके और पूरे अंधेरे में पढ़ना पड़े। वो किताबें ऐसी क्यों नहीं होती? इब्राहिम अराली, विलियम डालरनपुल, इरा मुखोटी, ये किताबें हम क्यों नहीं सिलेबस में लाते? ये गंदी किताब है, खराब है। रिव्यू तो यही हिस्टोरियन करते हैं, बहुत अच्छा रिव्यू करते हैं। इज वन ऑफ द बेस्ट बुक आई हैव रेड, इब्राहिम अराली, मुगल वर्ल्ड। I really don't understand why it should not be part of the easy reading for the history student. But वो पूरी की पूरी खेमेबाजी और झंडेबाजी शुरू हो जाती है कि because they are not professional historians. Many of the books, many of the historians, including people like Jaduna Sarkar and Didi Koshambi and Shirin Musvi and Athar Ali, were not historians. Someone was a lawyer, someone was a statistician, someone was a mathematician, Someone was an English professor, and they wrote far better English, far better history than many of them. So the whole idea, I'll conclude by saying that we got to introspect. We got to be moving. India is not in 1950s. India is not in 1970s and 80s as well. We need to have thematic studies. I should not be a teacher of medieval Indian history at Venkateshwara College. I should be a teacher of maybe societies. I have worked on Rajasthan. I have worked on films. I'm working on other mentalities and communities. But I must teach only medieval India because that is how the papers are designed. हमारे papers ऐसे designed हुए हैं कि हम कुछ कर ही नहीं सकते. तो उसमें लिमिटेड रिसर्च होता है. फिर आप स्टूडेंट जो हैं हिस्ट्री ऑनर्स के, आप ये पढ़ के जाते हैं, आप इसको गॉस्पेल ट्रुथ मान के जाते हैं. औरंगजेब के बारे में जो किताबें लिखी जाती हैं, क्या आपको मालूम है कि औरंगजेब for 4 years when he was the governor of Deccan, he fell in love with a girl called Hirabai. Fantastic history of his romance, drinking, music. मौसीकी से मोहब्बत हो गई उनको. भाई मोहब्बत में बहुत काची होती है. मोहब्बत में बहुत ऐसी ऐसी चीजें लाइक करने लगते हैं जो आप कभी पीते नहीं थे, जैसे ब्लैक कॉफी, ब्लैक टी. बहुत लोग करते हैं, आप लोग के एज में करते ही होंगे. औरंगजेब ने सब किया. लटक के आम भी तोड़े. उस लड़की के कहने पे आम भी तोड़े उन्होंने. गाने भी गाए. शराब पीनी शुरू कर दी. Such a beautiful story of a man who was not flat, who had the capacity to change. I'm not defending Aurangzeb. What Aurangzeb was, it is up to you to decide. What I'm saying is there are beautiful aspects of these histories which one must understand. हम पढ़ाने से क्यों डरते हैं पता है? भाई पुरानी बात, हमारी जिम्मेदारियां हिल जाएंगी. और ये जिम्मेदारी हम बचा के रखना चाहते हैं ताकि पब्लिशर हमारी किताब पब्लिश करे, सिवाय हमारी कुछ ना पब्लिश करे, हम ही रिव्यू करें. एक बहुत बड़ी बात है, मैं अब खत्म करूंगा, लेकिन विश्वमोहन जी मुझसे ज्यादा जानते हैं. हम जितनी किताबें रिव्यू करते हैं ना, मेरी वाइफ मेरी किताब रिव्यू करेगी, मेरा फ्रेंड मेरा करेगा, मेरी फ्रेंड की वाइफ मैं करूं, मेरी करेगी, मैं उसका करूंगा. इस आई कॉल इट अ बिग ग्रेट बुक इंडियन बुक रिव्यू फ्रॉड. मेरे पास पूरी लिस्ट है करीब 200-300 किताब की जो किन्होंने उसको रिव्यू किया है. क्लोजेस्ट ऑफ द फ्रेंड्स हैव रिव्यूड द बुक्स. इसी तरह से हम अपनी जिम्मेदारियां बरकरार रखते हैं. जमींदारी जिंदाबाद. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity, Ajit ji and Vishmohan ji, and of course ARSD College and the children. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Your words indeed helped us to think outside textbooks and understand this discipline in a different perspective. Chat box is overall. You may put your questions there, and all the questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Moving forward, good morning to one and all present over here. I, Andrea Avasthi, am greatly delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Vasudha Pandey, who has been a former associate professor in the Lady Shri Ram College of Delhi University. Ma'am has completed her schooling from St. Mary Convent School, her undergraduation from Allahabad University in Bachelor in Arts, Masters in Modern History from JNU, and PhD from Delhi University. Dr. Pandey has an extensive experience in vivid fields. She has been a fellow researcher at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, besides being a member of Institute of Lifelong Learning in DU. Ma'am is also a key part of Ethics Committee in General Hospital Gurugram as a social scientist. She has served as a social worker in Oxfordshire County Council in UK from 1979 to 81. Dr. Pandey has also been the academic secretary at CPDHE and IILLDU from 2010 to 2012, as well as undergraduate and postgraduate lecturer in English department at Kumaon University and Allahabad University. Ma'am has authored several books such as Cultures in the Indian Subcontinent, Volume 1 and 2. Her PhD thesis was based on Making Kumaon Modern with Family and Custom 1815 to 1930. She has also penned publications like Tibet Ek Samiksha Lokayan, along with Law of Women and Family in Colonial Kumaon. Furthermore, Dr. Pandey has been a member of salient projects like Environmental Studies of Central Himalayas by Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, colonial architectural heritage of Nainital, and a pilot project called Miniature Painters of Delhi, both organized by Ministry of Culture. Our estimable guest is a recipient of prominent awards, such as Daughter of Uttarakhand Award presented by Newspaper Owners Congress in 2016, and has been the chief guest and key speaker in the same year on Republic Day at Press Enclave, New Delhi. With this, take over and enlighten us all.
Thank you to the ARSD College for inviting me, and big thanks to my dear friend Vishwa Mohan Jha for giving me such a wonderful introduction, putting me in amongst the legends. I also would like to thank all the students who are here to listen to me, and of course, I'm very honored to be part of a panel with Professor Nirmal Kumar and Shankar, both of whom I have worked with as a colleague in the University of Delhi. I, of course, am delighted to be here also because one of my students from LSR, Vasudha Pandey, who also did her PhD with me, invited me here as well. And I'm glad to see that she is here. I can't see her on the screen, but that's not important. It's been very interesting. I've spent the last 1 hour listening to, more than 1 hour, I think, listening to the earlier speakers. And it's very important to understand why. And I think both Professor Nirmal Kumar and Dr. Shankar have filled you in on a lot of information about history, historiography, and the problems of pedagogy and syllabi. I would like to talk about, I'd like to start by talking about the discipline of history. And of course, clearly we have to talk about how we teach it. But since the topic is modern Indian historiography, that is what I have been given, I would come to that very soon. I'll just give you certain preface to what I would like to say, which is, I would like to add, and I think this is important for us to understand and locate the importance of historiography. But before that, maybe we should look at what are the coordinates of history and how has history as a discipline come to us, and why in that context is historiography important, right? So the coordinates of history, as we all know, all of you are students of history, are three. One is time, and I think Dr. Shankar explained that very well, the significance of time, the depth of time, the many pasts that we have had, the changing paths that we have had. So the temporal frame is always extremely important for any historian. Historian, as soon as you choose a PhD topic or a research topic, you are told, okay, ये डेट से वो डेट कितने दिन के, कितने सालों का, कितने centuries पे आप काम करना चाहेंगे, क्योंकि history is about time and context, and the other, of course, is the region, the space that which you would be looking at, because the whole world cannot really be your domain for a certain, even in a temporal, any kind of temporal frame. So the region would also include, of course, the people. And in that context, of course, it would also be the language. And I think it's extremely important that we understand that history is communicated through language. And in that language, we have to understand that when we do history and we try to talk about the past, very often this language of the present connects to the past, and we have to be very careful about avoiding anachronisms. What are anachronisms? As historians, very often what we and this is extremely, it's important and important to understand, because Professor Nirmal Kumar referred to this about caste, for example. I mean, India has had caste, we know, for last so many millennia, but to think of caste today doesn't mean that caste in the ancient world was the same. And therefore, we have to be very careful about avoiding anachronism through words. And a lot of these, a lot of present day problems of history writing is because we assume, we extrapolate that the past, because these words, we extrapolate the fact that these words existed in the past, but these are only, that these are a part of our vocabulary is not something that we understand, that they are part of our present day vocabulary. So we continue to do and write anachronistic history, which we have to avoid. But maybe we'll discuss that when you have questions about it, more specific questions. I would now like to go on to understanding the importance of history and historiography. So the discipline of history very clearly, and this is important to understand, you are doing this discipline, you are in second year, as I can understand, of history, and I'm sure you did history in school, because now it is imperative that you do history before you come to college, otherwise you don't get the choice of history. So when you study history, history is clearly, it's a difficult subject. A lot of people ask me कि आपने अंग्रेजी छोड़ के, अंग्रेजी साहित्य छोड़ के हिस्ट्री क्यों पढ़ा? तो उनको समझ में नहीं आता कि हिस्ट्री काफी मजेदार है. हिस्ट्री में काफी कहानियां हैं जो कि लिटरेचर से भी ज्यादा मजेदार कहानियां कभी-कभी इतिहास में मिलती हैं. और हिस्ट्री इज नॉट जस्ट कि मैं, और फिर लोग मुझसे कहते हैं आप पढ़ाती कैसे हैं? अरे बहुत बहुत बोरिंग होता होगा. तो मुझे कहना पड़ता है कि हिस्ट्री बोरिंग नहीं होता है, क्योंकि हिस्ट्री में हम नई नई चीजें पढ़ाते हैं. और यही एक चीज इंपॉर्टेंट है, that when we teach history, that when we study history, we are engaging, and I think this is extremely important to reiterate, that it is an engagement of the present with the past. It's not just about the past, right? It is a linking of the present with the past. And I think this is an important part of historiography, because through historiography, we keep ourselves in the present. And let me explain how we do that. Because if history was only about the past, then it would become irrelevant, no? But we all know, and all of us, at least in India and South Asia, know that history is extremely important in our lived lives. That's what Shankar said. That's what Nirmal ji has said. And so why is it important? Because it links to our present. It links to what we are. It links to our memory of ourselves, to our collective self, to how we see ourselves for the future as well. So this whole engagement of history of the present with the past through historiography is important. So the discipline of history, which is about the past, what does it do? There is no writing of history. कि आज मैंने सोचा कि मैं कुमाऊं पे काम करने चली जाऊं और मैं कुमाऊं का इतिहास लिख दूंगी. कैसे ऐसे लिख सकते हैं? आप जानते हैं ऐसे नहीं होगा. मुझे क्या करना पड़ेगा? मुझे पहले मैं क्या करा, मैंने जो किया मैं आपको बता रही हूँ कि मैंने सब जितनी किताबें लिखी हुई थी कुमाऊं पर, जहाँ जहाँ से मुझे मटेरियल मिला, जो मिला उसको पढ़ा, और उसके आधार पे मैंने एक हाइपोथेसिस बनाई कि मुझे क्या कहना है और मुझे क्या समझना है. और तो वो उस आधार को ही हम हिस्टोरियोग्राफी कहेंगे. Because knowledge is not a tabula rasa, it's not new. You build on earlier knowledge. The building on earlier knowledge is the process of historiography. How you understand how other people understood the region, that time, you bring that, you collate all of that, that makes it historiography. And so it's important to understand that historiography is the way we keep changing with a particular topic over a certain period of time. It can be a topic of modern India, it can be a topic of ancient India, it could be a topic of medieval India. And let me also say one important point here, that when we do historiography, and we do historiography whether we teach women in ancient India. I mean, when we teach women in ancient India, we don't only talk about the primary sources. We talk about the work that has been done on the primary sources. But I think the first few names that come to my mind when I talk about historiography of women in ancient India, I think of my contemporaries, Kumkum Roy. I think of Uma Chakravarti. So when we talk about these, the historiography, so the topic may be ancient or medieval, but the historiography has to be contemporary. It has to be new. It has to be about the present, or it has to be an engagement with the present. Otherwise, it would be meaningless. So I think this is extremely important for you to understand. And the term ancient and medieval is only for our convenience, that we demarcate certain stretches of time as antiquity, as barbarism, as etc., etc. But those stretches of time are important for the demarcations for the historian, so that we don't get into anachronistic problems. That is the point. But otherwise, all history is an engagement with the present. Okay, after I've said that, now maybe I should get on. I hope you've understood what a historiography is, what history is, and how we have to connect with it. Of course, since my topic has been modern, and also please understand that this ancient, medieval, modern, they are based on ways in which the world has changed. So very clearly, the ancient world was consisted of one kind of world. The medieval was supposedly another. Christopher Columbus, etc., all those changes that were brought about through globalization and trade. And then you have the modern world. But in India, of course, if you look at the question of the modern, if you look at European history, then what is modern? Modern is the coming of freedom. It's the coming of liberty, equality, fraternity. In India, modern is the reverse. It is, we become subject peoples. We are not citizens. So modernity in India is a different kind of story. And I think it's very important to understand that Indian modernity, therefore, or what some people would prefer to call South Asian modernity, is full of contradictions, full of paradoxes. And though we keep, and I think Nirmal ji ne bahut achhi tarah se emphasize kiya, that our whole sort of, because of this colonial modernity, is what I would call what India has. This colonial modernity has meant that we are constantly, our constant reference points is the West, is Europe, or is our colonization. And please let me remind you the fact that you and I are speaking in English today, and I'm still teaching history, Indian history in English, in maybe one of the best universities of India, bespeaks colonialism. We have not got out of colonialism. I hope you understand that. I'm not therefore against English. I'm just saying that we must understand. And I also believe that to write good history, you have to know Indian languages. You have to understand Indian languages, which you can know English, but you have to know the language of the people. So to talk about modern Indian historiography, of course, it begins, and Nirmal ji ne पहले आप लोगों को बता चुके हैं कि, और शंकर जी ने भी वहीं से शुरू किया था कि history writing, as it were, about India, as India. I mean, this is the scenario that we have, thanks to colonialism, thanks to the conquest of India by the British in 1757, 1764, 1761, whichever date you want to look at. The point is that colonialism gave to India, firstly, a kind of space which came together under them, and a history of that region. And interestingly, when we look at it, Shankar ji ne jo samjhaya, Orientalists were the first to be writing about these histories. They were the ones who were trying to understand India, to rule India, to conquer India. And in that process of Orientalist writing, we had, of course, very, very interesting work. Let me remind you, any one of you, whether you do ancient, medieval, modern, you will have to look at Asiatic Society papers. I went to the Asiatic Society library in Calcutta, and what an experience that was. Unfortunately, it's very badly maintained. I think we should give it much more respect, because it is our history here which has been collected for us. Anyhow, to come back to that, I would say, And I think this is extremely important. I'll just demarcate those areas and then I'll talk about one aspect of it. I don't know how much more time I have. I think I'll take another 15 minutes, which is that when I started teaching in 1987 in Lady Shri College, I started with teaching modern India. I was very fortunate. It was a delightful paper and I taught it all my life. And I'm very grateful that I had that opportunity and that luck. It was my good fortune. But when we started teaching, and I was taught, of course, by people like Bipan Chandra, Romila Thapar, S. Gopal, name them, all of them were there when we were studying in JNU. So when we started teaching, I realized that I had to teach modern India through historiography. And what was the historiography I taught? In 87, imperialist and nationalist. These were the two categories with which I would start any topic under the syllabus. So please remember imperialist and nationalist. This is 87. We start because remember, without imperialist history, we would not be able to have constructed nationalist history, right? Of course, over the years, at the time of my retirement, we had revised the syllabus many times. And of course, we had got new historiographies. So there was imperialist, nationalist, and within the nationalists, there was the division. I think some of you spoke about Marxist, some of you spoke about subaltern, others. There was also a new brand, which we must talk about, revisionist historiography, because we had to talk about that as well. So gradually, the historiographical frame had more. But the fact is that the basis, the foundational basis of Indian historiography has been imperialist and nationalist. And within nationalist, there is a whole range of writings which we have to cover. And I would say that we talked about Islamic nationalism, we talked about Hindu nationalism, we can talk about other forms of nationalism. And of course, there was the word Indian nationalism. So this is, again, a contentious issue, and I would like to talk about it, but I don't think I have the time for it. But let me first start, and I think this is extremely important to understand, that I would like to talk about what was called imperialist stroke colonial historiography. Because imperialist was, what was that history that was written by the British about India? And it's extremely important to understand that the history that the British wrote through their gazetteers, through their manuals, through a whole host of research that they did on India was actually a very, very important basis, foundational basis for India. This was the foundation which was laid, and very interestingly, colonial historiography became an important way in which we came to know ourselves. Indian nationalism was a product of contesting this colonialist historiography, but maybe I had thought I would do this today. I had thought I would spend much more time on it than I have given myself. So I'll just quickly go through colonialist historiography, because I think that is one thing that is now, because of the fact that we have such huge syllabi, we have such little time to transact, and of course, given COVID, it's even becoming more difficult to have long-term interaction with students because all of us are in such a rush, and of course, we don't have any one-to-one connections. So in that context, colonial historiography is extremely critical for us to understand and emphasize. I wish, and I do hope that, but anyhow, we are now ruled by NEP, so we won't have we won't even have probably the liberty to introduce things like colonial historiography. But I would like to talk about how in the 19th century, and 18th century has been done by both Nirmal and Shankar, so I'm not really talking too much about Orientalists, etc. But I would like to talk about people like James Mill. I hope you know the name of James Mill. James Mill was part of the Scottish Enlightenment, and of course, He was a great friend of Jeremy Bentham of the Utilitarian School. We can talk about that also later. But he was also, very importantly, the father of John Stuart Mill, who is one of the stalwarts of liberal thought in England. We could talk about that. But the point is that James Mill, interestingly, wanted to become a pastor. He wanted to, remember, theology was one of the most important branches of knowledge in the 19th century, but he didn't get his parish, so he then decided to write history. And of course, he became very closely involved with the East India Company, which was evolving at that time a syllabus for Haileybury College in London to teach English civil servants who were coming out to India. So a history of British India was written by him. And this became a very important template for Indian understanding of themselves. And let me remind you that even today, many of the ideas that go back, many people go back and are revisiting. You may not read it, but many of these things come up in the way in which we see ourselves. So history of British India became important. It was a very many volume history. And because James Mill was writing it for those who had conquered, those who were going to rule India, his understanding of the history, he had never visited India, he had never worked in India, but this history became, till the middle of the 19th century, one of the most important ways of understanding India for the British who came out here. And what did he say? This was the working out of a historical understanding of development of human history from the Stone Age to the modern age. And clearly, there was the story of progress. So India was implicated in the story of progress, but in its very conception, the story of India was one where she was backward. This idea that Mill said that both Hindus and Muslims were not sort of fully developed, and therefore the British, in a sense, were here to rule us because we were not. And I think that template became later used. Of course, we had people like Mount Stuart Elphinstone. His history was written in the 1840s. He was an English administrator who wrote a history, and he wrote a very much more informed history, much more understanding of the regional variations, of the niceties of Indian society. This textbook also was important for understanding of British scholars and British administrators. And then, of course, we also had other historians like Talboys Wheeler, and we had later on, of course, the other important historian after him was Lyell. They also wrote, and eventually a history which many of you who are planning to write the civil services, or who at some stage of their life wrote the civil service exam, the textbook which became probably the important textbook for understanding India was Vincent Smith. Believe it or not, I never had a copy of Vincent Smith, but when my nephew got through the civil services, after that, he came and gave me his copy of Vincent Smith, because he had no use for it. But understand that this textual information, this overload has actually affected the discourse and the writing of Indian history and the whole way in which we have constructed our Indian nationalism. So nationalist history is a response to what was written before. And therefore, nationalist histories which emerged in the 19th century and the early 20th centuries, which were Marxist, which were socialist, which were secular, which were Hindu, which were Islamic, all of them responded to this colonial stratum in the knowledge base that they had. And it is this which has, in a sense, structured our understanding of our present. And maybe what we can do now is, I don't think I have much more time, do I? I mean, can I elaborate some of these things?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You have time.
I have time? Oh.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. How much time? Tell me.
15 minutes, ma'am.
Okay, that's a lot of time. Thank you. Okay, then I will just give me 2 minutes. I'm recovering from Omicron, by the way. So I'm fortunate I don't have a bad cough at the moment. Okay, so now let us try and understand in what way this colonial historiography, I'm using the word colonial, and if you look at Ranjit Guha, he also talks about colonialist historiography. I would say that I have actually used the writing of Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, who was also my teacher, also Vishnu Mohan's teacher. He has a very brilliant piece called Colonial Historiography. If any of you want, I will share that with you. But colonialist historiography, what does it emphasize? What kind of history does it write? One is, I told you that for us, our modern history was our awakening to subjection. We were not free. We were the opposite of Europe. So we may copy the historical understanding of Europe. And let me remind you that while this history was being written here, in Europe also, the discipline of history was being fashioned. It was being made into an academic subject. It was being taught in universities. By the 19th century, in a sense, by the end of the 19th century, history as a discipline had developed. And you can read a lot on this in European. Yeah, I think it was in the syllabus when we used to teach European history. I had put it in intellectual history. The development of the discipline of history, sociology, and anthropology, these were very important developments in the 19th century. And India also, we can say, was part of that whole process of development of history. And so it's clear that we are part of the way we write history today and the way we study history today is very deeply influenced by the way it has been taught and read in the Western parts of the world. We may have had and I think we did have a tradition of history writing in India, but that is not what we have built up on. And maybe it can be done, I don't know. It's rather late for me, you would think of doing that. So, but what I was saying is that colonial historiography, one of the important templates of that colonial historiography was giving an understanding clearly about, and I would say, religious identities. Here, I mean, whether it is the way in which Mill writes about India, Hindus and Muslims, whether it's Elphinstone, what comes to the fore in this kind of writing is that India is an agglomeration of religious communities. I told you, Mill, like Marx. Marx also wrote a lot on India, but never visited India. These were people who were reading from others and commenting on that. And I think there is a problem with not doing field work. I think maybe they should have done some field work, but anyhow, the long and short of it is that they never understood the diversity of India and they reduced it to this. And of course, they also compared these communities. So they brought into the lexicon these kind of words of large-scale religious organizations. If in the 19th century you had asked somebody, early 19th century, you had asked somebody in India, are you a Hindu? You would not have got a yes. Or maybe even, but at least might have got a no, but certainly no, because people didn't see themselves in those categories. It is only gradually through British rule, through historical writings, through the census surveys, that gradually these categories of pan-Indian categories were constructed in a manner in which these words were energized very differently from the way they had been understood earlier. And very clearly, once these words were given to people to internalize and live with, and please remember, there was not only just this, the enumeration, caste census of India. I can tell you that in the census of India and the census of India, for example, in Kumaon, which is the region I have studied, that in 1865, a lot of people returned themselves as Shudras. But by 1871, and clearly by 1881, they knew that their census was going to come and ask you. So then the number of Rajputs went up and the number of Shudras went down. So remember how census categories, how these anthropological survey studies, how the People of India studies series, all of these have impacted how people have looked at themselves. And it is in this context that the emerging nationalism, as it were, in India, was one which was also a response to British rule. So as in Almora, which I have studied very clearly, people responded to British rule by saying we are Indians. They looked around and said, oh, in Madras, they're saying this. In Bombay Presidency, they're saying this. They went to Allahabad for the Congress. But at the same time, they also saw themselves as in the different census categories and in the different ways in which the British were looking at them. And it is here that I think it's important to understand that Indian nationalism, therefore, is a response to this. And as a response to this, to the understanding of colonial historiography. So today, when we say that India is, and this is something which is been reiterated again and again, people have said that we are basically religious, that Indians are basically all about their religious identities. This is what the British were saying. This is what colonial historiography is telling you. And therefore, Indian nationalism, which was, and this is where the Indian National Congress, to some extent, and people like those who thought about the alternative position, therefore had to argue against that. And they had to say that no, Indians are Indians, irrespective of their religious identities. But the colonial state was constantly identifying you through your religious categories, through your caste categories, through your, remember the word depressed classes is something which comes up in the early 20th century through the British. It is the British who also gave separate electorates. Think in Europe, people are actually doing away with religious categories. The Jewish emancipation is happening in Europe in the 19th century. Protestants and Catholics are not being discriminated on the basis of citizenship. And in India, citizenship is being instituted in early 20th century on the basis of religion by the colonial state. So I think somewhere colonial historiography is a very important aspect of how we look at ourselves and how we have been constructed, how the present, we are very clearly deeply influenced by that. So in a sense, if we look at the ways in which Indian nationalism has produced, it has produced a kind of nationalism where we all know that the Muslim League demanded a separate nation and got a separate nation for itself on the basis of religion. And let me remind you that the Communist Party of India, which did not believe in religion, actually endorsed the idea of a Muslim nation. So how do we start understanding these contradictions within India? And yet, and let me remind you, at the Round Table Conference, Gandhi was out of his depth. That's why he didn't go, because the Hindu Mahasabha was supposedly representing the Hindus. There was a Sikh contingent representing the Sikhs. There was a Christian contingent representing Christians. There was a depressed classes Ambedkar representing depressed classes, there was no category in the Roundtable Conference for Indians. And Gandhi had that, I mean, Gandhi had a problem. So the colonial state and colonial ideology and colonial, what we could call a colonial legacy is very clearly. And the fact that we accept this, I think, is that we accept colonial, we accept colonial policy. If we accept the religious divide. As a matter of fact, resisting the religious divide has been a hallmark of one kind of nationalism, but clearly there is not one kind of nationalism that we can identify as Indian, because in India, we've had diverse kinds of nationalism. It took us a long time to start studying all these nationalisms, but very clearly the emergence, and I think I don't know how many of you study modern India, but clearly now in modern India, we do teach the importance of the Hindu Mahasabha, the emergence, and I hope all of you have read, you should read Christoph Jaffrelot, you must read Zavos, about how there was the emergence of Hindu nationalism and that Hindu nationalist politics, that it is not something which is new, it is a product of colonial policy and colonial understanding. And therefore, resisting communalism is resisting colonial policy and colonialism. So somewhere, when we look at this whole gamut of nationalism, we must try and understand its various ramifications from left to right in terms of varieties of nationalism. And we must also try and understand how all these contest or accept the legacy of colonialism. We have, unless we do that, and as I've said, our colonialist legacy is still intact. And we must somewhere, in a sense, interrogate it and move beyond it for us to be a more successful nation in terms of our articulation of a community. I think I've taken more than my time now. Thank you so much. I think you gave me a full opportunity to explain on what positions I take. So thank you very much. I hope you understood what I said. If there are any questions, if you haven't understood, if you disagree with me, I would be very happy to respond to you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Your explanation made the complex nature of historiography lucid and vibrant. Thank you. Okay, moving on. Now we will be taking the questions. At first, I would request Priyam ma'am. Ma'am, can you please ask your question?
Hello, am I audible? Hello, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Am I audible? So, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to ask this question. This is not a question, basically, rather an observation. Do I have 5 minutes time? It might sound a little longish, then it might be boring. Do I have 5 minutes time to ask?
Yes, ma'am, but we are a bit running short in time.
Okay. So definitely I have heard, I mean, all the three lectures of the panelists, and this is something very interesting. Everybody has touched upon the notion of time. The notion of time, which is very, definitely is very less precise and ambiguous. It appears to be, but it's centrally crucial to the understanding of history. So there's very lack of uniformity also. Sorry, I might pent up a little because I'm suffering from Omicron. So give me a little, I will go a little slow. Then hello. Hello.
Yes, ma'am, your voice was breaking in between.
Yes. So what Shankarji was talking about, the catastrophic flood, and I mean, you know, the deluge myth, basically, what we categorically call it as. So when we talk and coming to such kind of, you know, metaphor symbols, so like we can come to the example of myth, the flood myth or the deluge myth. Okay, here it is to Shankarji actually. So here these kind of, you know, categorizations, conceptualizations, framing of conceptualizations of thought and practices in practice basically. This is a, you know, symbolization of such metaphors where we find that maybe the internet connection is unstable. Should I speak later on? Or I should finish now only?
Ma'am, what do you say? Should we continue? Like you can speak later on. It's
Okay,
according to you, ma'am.
let me try this last time. So these kind of symbolizations of kind of, you know, such kind of destructive flood is basically, it could destruct the disobedient original population. Isn't it some kind of a conceptualization of the, or a stress on the collective attitude, which is pretty unspoken consciousness? And it is expressed through such kind of elaborate theories. And it isn't this kind of a concern with the structure and beliefs of the time where people are basically kind of they are kind of it's their expression of everyday thought, their practices, their tactics, which will underlie a man's effort. It's kind of a man's effort has been underlined, where, you know, you can obtain what one wants within that kind of a limited framework of their thought or their expression, tools or the kind of things, ways of their being and behaving around that. Here, while we talk about the history mentality, it's so abstract, it's so huge, large. Like Sigmund Freud also, you know, he studied in detail individual psychology, the lapses of memory, slips of tongue.
Mubin, if I can pitch in, because to the extent I could hear you, or
Yeah.
organizers,
Sir,
can I take this question? Because there is audio
I was
disturbance.
on the verge of finishing this thing. Like if we take Louis Lenin's art pieces also, where habits and kind of practices, activities are there. Max Weber's, you know, categorization and conceptualization of the Weralt, that thing. And if you take Norbert Elias's, the concept of civilizing process. So we find so many attempts in history, the historiographical attempts, and which is outside history also, without history and within history. We find such kind of historiographical attempts to kind of, to put these practices, which is not something the backbone of history, but we try to put them within one framework. But it's so difficult to kind of put such kind of vast data to one category of framework, which would alter or replace this backbone of history, which already tend to exist and which we call as the industrialization of history. So this is my concern or understanding of the thing. I'm waiting for your response.
Okay, so do I respond to Mubin's question, or you want me to speak later? Organizers?
This is Priyam, Dr. Priyam Barua.
Okay.
Sir, it was Priya ma'am's question, and then please, you can answer the question.
Okay, okay. So Mubin has just given the voice to this. All right. So thank you for this sharp observation / question.
Sorry, this is Priyam only who's speaking. I mean, nobody has given my voice to my question. It's Priyam Barua who's speaking, sir.
Okay, Priyam. Okay, 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 I thought it's Mubin asking this question. So, okay, I got the name wrong. Sorry for that. It's a sharp observation. Let me admit your question. The point that I wanted to make with reference to historiography, the way it has evolved during the colonial period, exploring several aspects of deep past of India. It is in that reference that I quoted this catastrophic flood, and William Jones, who is simultaneously looking at several books, several early Indian treatises, getting them translated, by chance discovers something akin to this catastrophic flood that Christianity, or for that matter, Semitic religions, were so aware of, and it was so central to their thought process, and also according chronology to entire history that they knew, right? It is right at this time that the entire notion of time is getting redefined by sciences, by natural sciences, by geology, by evolutionary theorists like Darwin, right? By fossil studies, right? They are completely turning it on its head. And this religious understanding of time with which historians of Europe so far were operating looked evidently ridiculous. Yet, this champion of Indic studies and Orientalism in India is doing what in the European intellectual circuit is what I emphasized. And there I said that, there is a church in London, and just within the boundary of that church, there is a huge statue of William Jones. And just at the bottom of it, that Puranic reference is quoted, right? Here in India, it is dismissed as fable, right? Such huge units of time cannot be thought of. It is just concoction or part of human imagination, nothing more, no historicity to it. But the same excerpt is inscribed right below the statue of James Mill to assert that they have found an evidence from outside Christianity, from outside Europe, to scaffold the Christian notion of time that was fighting a losing battle with reference to Voltaire, who is the champion of reason and rationality, the Enlightenment icon. So there he is trying to resurrect the religious notion of time with which historians were operating so far. And I told about this predicament of these people because in their scholarship years, right in the middle of it, they find some kind of a paradigm change. And you also admitted that notion of time is so central to history writing. So it's getting redefined. I alluded to what physicists had to go through when Einstein similarly redefined this time-space matrix, right? And I still feel that we, as historians here, have not been able to inject and use this century-old conceptualization of time now with which scientists are operating, and we are still operating with that certitude model of Newtonian physics. That will not do. And we are in the middle of very fast changing data analytics. Facebook uses 20,000 coordinates for each of us who write on Facebook, right? So I am being assessed in terms of the choices that I make, in terms of my behavior pattern or whatever, in terms of 20,000 nodes, 20,000 data points to to define me and my behavior. 5 to 6 parameters to define myself, right? So we are in the middle of this kind of a thing, and historians, like practitioners of several other disciplines, I would say, will have to deal with it. Otherwise, this challenge is formidable, right? So it is with reference to this that I wanted to highlight this point, that this destructive flooding and so forth, I'm not saying that it has to be used as a cardinal principle, this myth kind of a thing, but William Jones is writing at a point of time when myth is getting separated from history proper. It is right at this point of time that this redefinition is happening. Otherwise, in India or even elsewhere, myth, the distinction of actual events, verifiable events, evidence-based events with mythical events was not that clear, right? And they were legitimately part of history. And one more thing that I would like to emphasize, which I had alluded to, that the historical linguistics, that is a spin-off of the Oriental study or colonial studies, I would say, if you look at, I think Professor Vasudha Pandey was mentioning about it, Asiatic Society lectures, annual lectures, and William Jones was very fond of it. So he would deliver these lectures and take stock of situations, and there is a record of that. If you look at them, you realize that what he's trying to do after 4 or 5 years of the formation of Asiatic Society of Bengal is looking at the annual reports and saying that, okay, now do this, now go and find out this. And here, he's not looking only at India. He is also directing his officials to keep an eye on what this Oriental society is all about and why. What is the motive? Where is that intent coming from? The intent is again located in religion. The sons of Noah who got to different parts of the planet, and it is that set of people who are emerging as different language nationals, right? Different language nationals in different parts of Asia. And that is what he's trying to locate, right? Inadvertently or in an unplanned way, of course, as scholarship moved, it got pushed into a different direction, thankfully, but the real intent is coming from there. And as a historian, we have to track that. We have to track that. The original motive at the point of time that William Jones is operating is coming from religion. In India, he is projected as something else. In Europe, he is still deep in the quagmire of that religious debate, reason versus religion, pitted against none else than Voltaire himself. And these are some of the fascinating ambiguities that we as students of history come across. So that's what I was alluding to. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. The next question to you is by Sayandeep Das. He's asking, considering the persistent changes that the idea of history has underwent change, and presuming that most of them are induced by the immediate ideational inclinations of the socio-cultural milieu, there also happen to be texts that may seem aberrations against the banal trend adhering to circumstantial constraints. So, sir, would it be overtly presumptuous on part to innocuously accept that historiographical changes progress in a neat, unilinear progression and not as it seems a checkered crystallization difficult to adequately demarcate?
Okay, thank you. Again, another very good question. I would love to answer this. As late as yesterday, I was reading one brilliant article, not from history, but from psychology and mind studies. And I just got lured into it by chance. And these days, we end up scrolling almost purposelessly our smartphones, and you get pop-ups that are at times very luring, and you get drawn to it. You know, it was about what do we do? What are I? It was about visual inputs and what our mind does with it. With our naked eyes, we see so many things around us. The visual data is coming every fraction of a second, right? And it's part of the input that our mind gets. But what does the mind do to it? There is a chaos of visual data. There is a chaos of audio data that we are exposed to in our lifetime. And how does mind process it? And in that researched article, I read that there is a demonstrated 15-second lag in processing whatever visual and audio input that we give to our mind. So even at the mental level, we process things, delete, sideline quite a few inputs. They legitimately are inputs, but we retain only a snapshot or only a select input so that leisurely we can make some sense out of it. So I'm not saying that there are other trends not there in history writing. They are there. They are simultaneously there, right? In a group of three panelists, of course, we have different tangents into which we moved, right? But as a student, when you have to process it, you have to keep some, leave out something else, or be oblivious of something else and process it to make it meaningful for you. This is, I would say, this is a part of human incapacity, that we can't instantaneously process everything. Our mind does not do it. We are not wired to process any and every damn little thing that comes as inputs to our mind, right? There is a demonstrated lag of 15 seconds. That's what I said. So even in historiography, this is how historians go about it. So there is no unilinearity as you are alleging. It is purely for the purpose of making some sense out of barrage of information and trends of history writing that we get. Of course, ultimately, it's a matter of consensus, and one is free to counter this and to say that, well, we need to mainstream this tangent of history writing as well, or we need to remove this particular trend of history writing from the mainstream historiography that otherwise the textbooks have been talking of. So these things, you and I are so exposed to these days. So these contestations are always there. I deliberately did not mainstream some trends of writing, but certainly there is a broad consensus about it. And that is the only limited point that I was making. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is to Professor Nirmal Kumar. Sir, I request you, can you please turn on your camera? Yes, sir. This question to you is by Abhishek Kumar Gupta, sir. Sir, as a student, when we read any topic because of the surroundings where we have grown, bias tends to occur based on ideology, religion, region, and other factors. So, as a student, how can we overcome through our biasness regarding any topic to get a real and unfiltered history? Sir, I think your mic is mute.
No, I was unmuted from your side. I was muted from your side. I couldn't unmute myself.
I'm really sorry, sir.
Well,
Yes, sir.
no, it's okay, it's okay. So, you know, biases are fine. I have absolute no problem with biases, as long as they are biases. I have a problem when you put it in historiography. I have a problem when you put it in syllabi. I don't have a problem. You be and from any region, you be from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, literally from any language, from any background, from any right left background, but it must be known. It must not be put as an impartial history to me. And I must not be forced to teach and read that partial history as impartial history. Biases are absolutely fine. You will have biases. You will have ideological biases. You will have religious biases. I mean, we do have books written from Marxist perspective, from non-Marxist perspective, from Chicago school, from Cambridge school. All kind of history is there. Look at the, like when I teach history of decline of the Mughal Empire, we talk about from Jaduna Sakar or even British historian to Bailey. We have all kind of histories, and even later, all people, Muzaffar Alam and all are writing from their own biases, from their own views. They're academic biases, they're very healthy. Even your community biases, I wouldn't use communal word in India because the way we understand communal is only in Hindu and Muslim. It is not. Look at the Oxford Dictionary. It doesn't talk about communalism like this. But if you look at community or a communal bias also of community, I have absolutely no problem. You can write a history of a particular caste. You can write a history of a particular community with a bias. You know, biases are very healthy. वो सर्फ का ऐड देखा है ना, दाग बहुत अच्छे हैं. Their dogs are very good as long as someone can wash them. Someone has a surf, 10 rupees का surf, and you can wash. जब वो wash नहीं होता तब problem होती है. Problem होती है जब हम अपने biases को, अपनी ग्रंथियों को, अपने problems को समाज पे थोपते हैं, पढ़ाई में थोपते हैं, दूसरे पे थोपते हैं. As long as I understand what you are saying, this is absolutely fine. Biases को शक की निगाह से मत देखो. बायसेस को बायस की निगाह से देखो, फिर बहुत सारी चीजें बहुत क्लियर हो जाएंगी तुम्हारे लिए. वो होता है क्या कि तुम्हें अभी जिंदगी में ग्रो करना है, तुम्हें पढ़ना है बहुत सारी चीजें. आप नॉवल पढ़ते हो, आप एक नॉवल पढ़ते हो पंजाब से करतार सिंह दुग्गल का या अमृता प्रीतम का, एक नॉवल पढ़ते हो फनीश्वरनाथ रेणु का बिहार से, एक पढ़ते हो आप किसी का बंगाल से, और एक पढ़ते हो आप कारंत का. 4 नॉवल पढ़ते हो 4 डिफरेंट रीजन से. आजकल आपके पास OTT है, आप सारी फिल्में देखते हो, Malayalam film देखते हो without understanding a word of Malayalam. You see a Kannada film, you see a Telugu film, a Marathi film. I happen to watch one very lovely Marathi film, Jimma. कभी देखना मराठी में, सबटाइटल के साथ है. Lovely film. देखो, Great Indian Kitchen Malayalam में देखा. I don't understand. I understand there is a bias. I understand there is a filmmaking, a process is different. I do understand as a person who works on film, I saw that there was editing was different. It was the acting was different. The way the dialogue delivery, the scene cutting was different, but I enjoyed it. सुंदरता उसी में होती है जब आप उसके बायसेस को समझ के उसको करते हैं. बायस से घबराने की जरूरत नहीं है अभिषेक. बायस तो होगा. तुम्हारा बायस है बॉय, किसी का बायस है गर्ल, किसी का बायस है इंपीरियलिस्ट हिस्टोरी, किसी का हिस्टोरियन, किसी का बायस है नॉन इंपीरियल हिस्टोरियन. चलेगा. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And sir, the next question to you is by Sambhav Jain. Sir, he's asking, please throw some light on medievalism or modernism in African nations. Isn't it a trend to talk either from European perspective or South Asian perspective? Sir, along with that, I would like to add my question as well. What should the criteria for medievalism and modernism be different for different parts of the world, if we talk about Latin America or the Americas in general? Sir, your mic is mute again. I'll just check if it's our problem.
Make Nirmal sir co-host.
No, it says that speakers are not allowed to unmute themselves. Only organizers can mute or unmute them. वो मेरी माइक तुम्हारे पास है. देखो ये भी बायस है. मेरी माइक कि मैं बोलूं कि नहीं बोलूं वो तुम्हारे पास है. तो इसीलिए मेरी भी मजबूरियां हैं. तो मुझे वो पार्लियामेंट में माइक खींच लेते हैं, माइक की तारें निकाल लेते हैं. तो वही हाल है मेरा भी. वो देखो ऐसा होता है क्या कि yes, you are right, you are right, you are absolutely right that we must be able to, we must be am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
We must have regional bath. No, हम साउथ एशियन पर्सपेक्टिव से ही देख रहे हैं, मैं तो कह ही रहा हूँ. We earlier saw from imperialist or colonial perspective. Now we see from South Asian perspective. We see from European perspective. देखो मैं कह रहा था कि like what is medieval in India, what is ancient in South India is not ancient for North India. यहाँ ही फर्क आ गया है, बल्कि उसमें भी फर्क है. 4 रीजन जो साउथ के हैं, कन्नड़ा, तमिल एंड केरला एंड ये तेलुगु, इनमें भी medieval का फर्क है, इनमें भी रीजन्स का फर्क है, सब कुछ हिस्टोरियोग्राफी का फर्क है. तो वो फिर नॉर्थ में फर्क पड़ जाता है. यूरोप से हमारा अलग है, ऑफ कोर्स लैटिन अमेरिका एंड अफ्रीका का बिल्कुल डिफरेंट है. एंड देयर इज नथिंग रॉन्ग having your own periodization. There is nothing wrong. What I am saying is these periodizations sometimes are too Eurocentric. They don't help us. They don't really help. हमारा ancient हमारा उनका ancient नहीं है. हमारे ancient regime भी नहीं था. उस तरह का ancient हमारे यहाँ नहीं है. शंकर can say better than on ancient than me or Vishmon sir can say. But हमारा ancient उनसे फर्क है. हम जैसे देखते हैं वो भी फर्क है. Medieval तो बिल्कुल ही फर्क है. बिल्कुल ही फर्क है. लेकिन वो medieval भी region by region is different. And that is why it should be. I have absolutely no problem in it being different, it being regional, it being local. अब इसीलिए तो फिर different regions of different types of history भी पैदा होती है ना. That is why different type of histories हम लिखते हैं, जिस तरह से हम बताते हैं आपको, वो different होता जाता है. वो हमारा perspective है. And there is nothing wrong with my perspective. The way we teach, example देता हूँ. The way I teach, we teach, मैं European history नहीं पढ़ाता, पर जो पढ़ाते हैं वो बताएंगे आपको. The way we teach European history is not taught that way in Europe. The way we teach Indian history is not taught. मैंने देखा है यूरोपियन हिस्ट्री में जहां मैं पढ़ाता हूँ, पढ़ाया है कई बार, वो मेटकाफ एंड मेटकाफ से पूरी किताब पढ़ा देते हैं. मेटकाफ की किताब लेते हैं. मेटकाफ आपने शायद नाम भी नहीं सुना होगा उसका. मेटकाफ इज अ बिग हिस्टोरियन, बट आपने उसकी किताब नहीं देखी होगी. हिस्ट्री ऑफ इंडिया टेक्स्ट बुक है जो हमारे लायक भी नहीं है, बहुत ही बेसिक लिखी हुई है. वहां का टीचर उस किताब को लेकर वर्बैटिम पढ़ जाता है और बच्चे उसी से पढ़ते हैं, उसी से मार्क्स लाते हैं. और जी हिस्ट्री पढ़ाने का उनका ढंग अलग है. अगर मैं लिखूंगा हिस्ट्री ऑफ इंडिया तो मोस्ट लाइकली वो उसको अपने यहाँ लगाएंगे भी नहीं. या हिस्ट्री ऑफ कोई और यूरोप लिख लूं मैं, हिस्ट्री ऑफ डेनमार्क लिख दूं मैं. ये सब चलता है. दिस इज पार्ट ऑफ लाइफ. हाउसोएवर गुड हिस्ट्री आई राइट ऑफ इंग्लैंड, ऑफ डेनमार्क, मेरी हिस्ट्री वहां नहीं पढ़ाई जाएगी. उनका अपना पर्सपेक्टिव. तुम उनके नॉनसेंस भी नहीं समझते. हमारे लिए वाइकिंग सिर्फ एक जोक है, हमारे लिए वाइकिंग सिर्फ एक कार्टून है. उनके लिए वाइकिंग की हिस्टोरिकल बैकग्राउंड है. और हर बात पे वाइकिंग लाते हैं. वो वाइकिंग लाएंगे, वो उस तरह की चीजें लाएंगे जो आपको समझ में भी नहीं आता कि व्हाट इज एन वाइकिंग. आप सिर्फ देखते हो वो क्या कॉमिक आता है, हगार द हॉरिबल. तो वाइकिंग जाता है इंग्लैंड, जाके कैसे वो कब्जा कर लेता है, इंग्लैंड को पकड़ के ले आता है, फिर भी अपनी वाइफ से कितना डरता है. और वो पूरी जो स्टोरी है वो वाइकिंग की, वो आपके लिए एक सिर्फ स्टोरी है. बट अगर आप डेनमार्क चले जाओ तो दे आर वेरी टची अबाउट वाइकिंग्स. दे आर वेरी टची अबाउट द होल स्टोरी ऑफ वन पर्टिकुलर थिंग. आपको समझना है उसको. इंग्लैंड से जो राइवलरी है वो हम समझ ही नहीं सकते इंडिया में बैठ के. हमारी सेंटिमेंट्स नहीं है. यू नो व्हेन यू टॉक ऑफ डायलेक्टिकल मटेरियलिज्म एंड मार्क्स से कॉन्सेप्ट बताओ ना, तो डेनमार्क का एक टीचर था, तो वो बोला कि इसका आपका क्या कहने का मतलब है कि हमारे यहाँ क्लास स्ट्रगल नहीं हुआ तो हमारी हिस्ट्री नहीं है. व्हाट डू यू मीन? वी हैव होल नेशन. 50 साल पहले तक डेनमार्क वाज अ पेजेंट कंट्री. कुछ नहीं होता था उनके यहाँ सिवाय कुछ क्रॉप्स के. तो उस हिस्ट्री को उनको बड़ी मुश्किल होती है कि हमारी हिस्ट्री क्या इतनी साल भी पुरानी नहीं है. नो, हिस्ट्री कहाँ से आती है और कैसे आती है इसको समझने के लिए फिर उनके यहाँ पूरी मोटी मोटी किताबें हैं हिस्ट्री ऑफ डेनमार्क, और वो पढ़ाते हैं. वो उन नोशन को भी पढ़ाते हैं जिनको आप मजाक समझते हैं. थैंक यू.
Thank you, sir. My next question is to Vasudha ma'am, and the question is by Sagarika. I hope ma'am you are able to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, the question is, why did the Communist Party in India endorse the formation of Pakistan as a Muslim state?
I think there's some other questions also. I can read Kanishka Joshi.
Yes, ma'am, I'll be reading out that even.
Okay, okay. So let's start with the endorsement of Pakistan by. Just hold on. I can't see myself. Can you put me on the frame? So it's we're all sort of a bit of narcissist people here. So okay. Let me just see. Oh, start video. My video is not started.
Harshvardhan, you just see that.
Okay, okay, can you see me now?
Yes, ma'am, you are visible.
Okay, right. So now this question is a very interesting question because I think it will take you to some kind of understanding of a theoretical understanding of nationalism. I hope you know that the idea of nationalism, there's been a major discussion. It's on the basis of nationalities. I hope you know about the discussion on nationalities, which has been a very major part of the writings on nationalism. So the idea is that a culture which is premised on a language defines a culture, it defines a cultural community, and according to what was developed as a theory in the 19th century in Europe, and which was written about by Lenin and later by Stalin as well, the theory of nationality talks about how a language defines a culture, how it defines a nationality. So as you might know, the Communist Party of India believed in this understanding of nationality, and eventually they accepted the idea that the idea of a Muslim community was premised upon a community, and that community was a nationality, and therefore they accepted the idea. Of course, later on they questioned that as well, but for a temporary phase, because this was something which they were. And so as you can see how powerful colonial ideology can be. And you must understand that colonial ideology restructured, or I should not say restructured, structured the understanding of nationality and community in colonial India from the outset. And it constructed these identities, it encouraged certain kinds of identities. It certainly did not encourage the idea of citizenship, of one citizenship, or it did not, neither did it encourage the idea of equality, fraternity, and liberty. And I hope you, those of you who are studied this, that Ambedkar was the one who picked up this idea from the French Revolution, which was European, and actually said that this has to be the undergirding of India. But this undergirding was not something which came to us as an experience of modernity. It came to us as an experience out of colonial modernity from a person who was resisting a certain form of colonial ideology. So nationalism is also a reaction, and maybe a form of reaction to colonial ideology. And it can take different forms, different kinds of nationality issues can come up as a consequence. So I hope that that answers your question. Who was this question asked by?
It was Sagarika, ma'am.
Sagarika. Okay, so Sagarika, I hope if there's anything else you would like to know, please do go ahead. Okay, maybe you can ask me the other question and Sagarika can then ask later on, because I think we are also
yes,
short of time, no? I think.
Yes, ma'am, that is.
I know that, don't worry, don't worry. You can cut me short also when I'm talking, don't worry.
No, ma'am.
No problem. Bolo.
A recent work on modern, ma'am, this question is by Raj Sahu. He's asking, a recent work on modern India is by Professor Ishita Banerjee Dubey, who referred the nature of 18th century as colorful world. How do you see this? How could we connect decline of Mughal Empire and the rising of regional states as modern? And ma'am, with that, I would like to add one more question that's by Joshua. He is asking, hadn't the British invade India, will the name or the period modern India still exist in classification of Indian history, and will it be still applicable to call modern Indian history? Or is it called modern Indian history because India has attempted to establish a somewhat middle position between Western and the communist oriented states, or is there any other reason behind it?
Okay, okay. I think I'm glad you've clubbed both those questions together. I think it's important to understand that certainly Indian history begins with colonial history writing, and the idea of ancient, medieval, and modern come from that. But it's very interesting. If you look at colonial historiography, what does it say? Ancient is Hindu, medieval is Muslim, then why is the modern not Christian? Which is a kind of logical, kind of descriptive category. I think there is this problem with it, and clearly the modern is given to India because it is something which changes the Indian context, brings up something different. But let me also tell you that Indian history, and this is what Professor Nirmal Kumar was referring to, that there was a major debate in the 1980s about this classification in terms of ancient, medieval, and modern. Professor Harbans Mukhya and Bipan Chandra and Professor Romila Thapar wrote about this, about how this ancient and medieval cannot be classified according to this terminology, and therefore very interestingly there were major discussions. I still remember there were the debate was that there is an ancient social formation, and when the ancient social formation in South Asia is changing around the 750s with the coming of, within inverted commas, feudalism, because again, that is another kind of debate, then we have the ancient period. So ancient period, very clearly Indian historians questioned this idea, which was given to us by the colonialists. And I hope you may know, and of course, for a very long time in BA program, the medieval period was still what was it, 1000 to 1707. But actually in the honors papers, this was changed, because if 750 is when the ancient period ends, then you have the early medieval and you have the second, whatever, the medieval too. But also again, and I think this is extreme, this links up to the next question that we have. And I think it's important to understand that there is a debate, or maybe, let me think. Yeah, I think I've answered the first question. So the medieval debate is very interesting. So then we begin in 750. So we don't begin with the advent of Islam. And as we all know that Islam came in India at different times historically. So it may have come in through, it came to Kerala much earlier. So again, we have to be very careful about these periodization, but clearly Indian historians have demarcated and changed the periodization. But when we talk about the modern, and this is where it is interesting, I said to you that it should have been a Christian period, which colonial historians didn't agree with. But of course, because at that time, the Christian debate, and I think Shankar has mentioned that in the 19th century, the debate was very strong between the Neoplatonists and the Christians. I hope you know that Darwin took so long to publish his book because he didn't want to make the church very unhappy, and he wouldn't have published if he hadn't been told by his friend that someone else is going to publish. This man was already with the publication on the same basis. So, so remember that this questioning of Christianity in the 19th century was something which was, and in a sense, the retreat of religion from the state. I'm not saying that there was a retreat of religion per se, but the state not recognizing religious identities in Europe and in parts of the Western world was a 19th century phenomenon. So they preferred to call themselves modern. And in any case, they were fighting for modern things. They were fighting for nationalism. They were fighting for liberty. They were fighting for equality. They were fighting for fraternity. The socialist vision had already occurred. The Communist Manifesto had already been written. So we must understand that Europe did see that the 19th, late 18th and 19th century as modern. And of course, what Professor Nirmal Kumar has pointed out, that they have an early modern, we don't have an early modern. And this is where I bring in the question about the 18th century, about what Ishita Banerjee Dubey has, of course, written a textbook. Please let me remind you, she has not been able to summarize all the debates about the 18th century. And as you know, what Nirmal Kumarji said was, "Aajkal we study the 18th century as one century," which is very interesting. But of course, you know, Irfan Habib doesn't agree with that. So many other people don't agree with that. It's the revisionist position is there, and Christopher Bailey has changed. Actually, talking about how historiographies change, they're not unilinear. Christopher Bailey's phenomenal work on the 18th century has changed the historiography of the 18th century in a paradigmatic manner. Which is what Shankar was referring to. And I think we should understand that. That is of great significance. We may disagree with Bailey. I don't. I think his work is phenomenal because he has done such rich, textured work. And as a matter of fact, Christopher Bailey and many other historians of the what we would call medieval period are arguing that the Mughals actually are early modern. So that is a very important ongoing debate in Indian history about periodization. It has, the jury is out, but there's been no final decision. I think it will take some time. I don't know. With NEP, we may not even get that thing, but maybe it will still be battled through in IESHR and other sort of good historical journals, because the early modern is something which a large number of people are arguing, which is on the basis of the fact that India did have print, the emergence of print, emergence of writing, sense of self-reflexivity, etc., which Europe had seen. So this idea that because we were colonized, our historical periodization will remain what the British said has been interrogated, it has been changed, and it continues to be interrogated. And it's very interesting that the person who initiates this change in terms of the 18th century is Christopher Bailey, who is known as, according to Bipan Chandra, as a neo-colonialist, but he's a revisionist of the Cambridge School. But clearly, Cambridge School is also considered imperialist by a large number of people. So I think this is the richness of history. This is the textured quality of history. And therefore, history is not boring. I think somewhere else I have a question on that, but maybe we'll wait for that. I think, let me just read that question. Can you read out that question about Ishita Banerjee Dubey again, so that I can understand it again and respond to it more carefully? Hello? Hello?
Suchishmita?
Doesn't matter, forget it then.
Suchishmita?
I think she may be taking a break. It's all right. Okay. Can we carry on? Oh. Have we lost her?
No, yes, ma'am. I got that question. This is to Professor Vasudha Pandey. A recent work on modern India is by Professor Ishita Banerjee Dubey, who referred the nature of 18th century as colorful world. How do you see this? How could we connect decline of Mughal Empire and rising of regional states as modern?
Okay, see, I haven't answered it. Okay, I'll try and answer it very quickly. One is, it is a colorful world in the sense that the 18th century in India is extremely rich in terms of the diversity that it poses for us. The kind of what people like James Mill, etc., did was to give it a sort of monotone, which was so boring, which was that India is backward because of its women, it doesn't treat its women properly, it's like this. But actually, India was a very vibrant society. And the breakup of the Mughal Empire, I think this is the important point, was not because that the peace had been broken, but because of the prosperity that it had brought. And this prosperity was visible across the nation, right? Across the South Asia, I shouldn't say nation, there was no nation at that time. And this, therefore, what she calls colorful. Colorful is important because here, we have Bharatpur, we have the kingdom of Bharatpur, which was being referred to in Amit Shahji's speech earlier. The Jats, the Sikhs, the Afghans, many of them had questioned Mughal sovereignty. In the south, you had a completely different kind of development was happening. And if you read Ershek, you read Prasannan Parthasarathy, you read David Washbrook, then you also see, and I think this is extremely important to read people like Prasannan Parthasarathy, that they are saying that the possibilities of change, of the variety that was happening in Europe were also possible here. But it is true that the conquest of India by the British closed many of those options slowly but surely, and that was the tragedy of India. But clearly in the 18th century, India was like the rest of Europe. As a matter of fact, I would like to compare it to Napoleonic Europe. And I do very often. I used to teach both Europe and India. And I find that there were very major similarities. Hyder Ali and Napoleon are very similar. Please remember. What is Napoleon? Napoleon is also a soldier who becomes a general and then becomes a ruler. And that's exactly what happens here also in Mysore. So I think we must understand these analogies. And I think it is for this reason that historiography is important, because it keeps making you read the fresh interpretations, the new interpretations. And it is through the light of the old and the coming of the new that you actually get the historical sense. That somebody had asked Professor Nirmal Kumar about how do you understand what it is? Because all historians are biased. No historian, I think only Mill claimed it that I'm objective because I don't know anything. I'm not I don't know any language of India. I have not visited India. But that's not it's a bad bias. But a bias everybody has. The question is, through historiography, you can see how people have structured their arguments. You've seen what they have left out. And what is a paradigmatic change? That when all that has been left out in earlier historiographical traditions comes together and gives a new insight into the past or into the future, that is the paradigmatic change. That's how science has evolved, and that is how history as a discipline also evolves. Let me tell you that. Okay. I think I have answered. Any other question?
Am I audible now, ma'am?
Yes, yes. Sorry, you weren't audible earlier. Doesn't matter. Okay, I got
yes, ma'am. I apologize for that.
No, you don't have to apologize. Please, sorry, don't do that. It's all right. Come on, go on.
Ma'am, I hate to say that, but we cannot take any more questions due to the time constraint.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Now I would request Ajit sir to say a few words.
So, thank you very much. I share a common alma mater with two of my senior colleagues who happen to be the guest speaker for 2 days. Shankarji, I share alma mater with Sainik School Talaya and Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he is very kind that he accepted our invitation. Whenever I approach, he, with all his positivity, he always obliged me to share his knowledge. Second, Professor Nirmal Kumar, I happen to be sharing alma mater in Hansraj College, where we used to meet whenever there was alumni meet organized by History Department of Hansraj College. And also, as Professor Nirmal Kumar has also pointed out, that we share neighborhood, but recently that we started approaching him to speak also, being a neighbor, and he has also taught many of my Chilean batchmate at Shri Venkateshwara College. So I'm also thankful to you, sir, that with your vast experience and knowledge, you shared your knowledge on historiography. With Vasudha ma'am, I remember that she happened to be my head examiner of history of modern Europe at, if I remember correctly, then at Gargi College, where I met, and he trained me how to look each and every word and sentence of a student which he or she writes, and how to award the marks. So I'm very much thankful, ma'am, though it was I gave this opportunity to call Vijika ma'am to tell you to come to this workshop. So I'm so thankful to all three of you, my senior colleague, that you shared your knowledge and wisdom with the colleague of our college and colleague of other colleges who joined in present here or in the virtual world through Facebook or through other mode. So I'm really thankful to all three of you. And at last, I'm also thankful to my senior colleague, Professor Vishmohan Jha. It was his idea that we should organize one workshop on historiography, because historiography is the base for the student of University of Delhi, and the speaker's choice was also given by him. So I'm really also thankful to Professor Vishmohan Jha sir also, and all my worthy colleagues who joined this August morning. And we are till now we are still 134 participants. So I'm very much thankful to everyone. So now I tell Suchishmita to do a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Now I would request Rupal, the president of Dastan Department of History, to present the vote of thanks.
Am I audible now?
Yes, Rupal, you are.
Thank you, Suchishmita. So good afternoon, everyone, to the one and all present here, honorable chief guests, respected teachers, and all the participants from various colleges who joined us. On behalf of the Dastan History Department of Atma Sanatan Dharma College, I, Rupal Jain, deem it a great honor and privilege to deliver vote of thanks. At first, I would like to express my gratitude to our honorable chief guests, Dr. Shankar Kumar, Professor Nirmal Kumar, and Dr. Vasudha Pandey for taking out time from their busy schedule to grace the event. Thank you for inspiring and encouraging us with your insightful words. A special thanks to Professor V.M. Jha sir, Ajit sir, and Deepankar sir for providing immense support to make the workshop successful. I must thank the organizing team and volunteers for working hard for the past few days to make this workshop successful. I congratulate all the participants for their active participations. Thank you everyone for making it a great success.
Thank you, Rupal. And now it's my last request to everyone. Kindly switch on your camera so that we can take a screenshot and mark this memory. Abhishek and Harshvardhan, please inform when it is done.
Yeah, sure, I'll inform.
Thanks are also due to the technical team of Ravinder Pant and Manvendra ji, who happens to be the colleague of our college. So he made it possible that it should go on live on Facebook page of RSD College. So thanks are also due to both of them.
Okay, thank you everyone. Screenshot have been taken. Thank you.
Manvendra ji, are you here? Manvendra ji, Harshvardhan, you see that Manvendra sir is here?
Yes, sir, let me check.
And you tell him that
Oh, sir, actually, he's not here right now.
Okay, so just let me call. So thank you, Vishwan sir.
एक बार फिर से हम सब की ओर से सबका धन्यवाद। स्पेशल थैंक्स आपको अजीत जी, सब कुछ आप ही करते हैं। Okay. Shall we call it a day?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.